She was already at sea when the war began, and she never truly left it. While smoke still hung over Pearl Harbor and the Pacific reeled from shock, the USS Enterprise was moving through open water, her decks alive with aircraft, her crew unaware that history had just accelerated beyond recall. By the time the first reports arrived, the rules of naval warfare had changed, and Enterprise would spend the rest of the war proving exactly what that meant. This was not just a ship. It was endurance given steel and motion. From the opening weeks of the Pacific War to its final, violent months, Enterprise fought almost continuously. She was present at more decisive moments than any other American warship. Not because she was lucky, but because she was always where the war demanded pressure, risk, and resilience. The early months were survival. American naval power was thin, scattered, and improvising under fire. Enterprise became both shield and spear, striking when possible, withdrawing when necessary, and returning again before the enemy could reset. She carried inexperienced pilots into combat and brought back veterans forged in fire. At places like Midway, her aircraft changed the course of the war in minutes. Enemy carriers burned, momentum shifted, the illusion of Japanese invincibility shattered. But Midway was not an ending. It was a beginning. Enterprise moved relentlessly through the Solomon Islands campaign, where victory came slowly and at terrible cost. She endured constant air attack, near misses, direct hits, and repeated damage. Fires were fought on her decks while aircraft still launched. Repairs were made at sea because time could not be spared. Then there was no quiet period. When other ships rotated home, Enterprise stayed forward. When losses mounted, she absorbed more. When the front moved west, she moved with it. Her crew became a living archive of the Pacific War, men who had seen the war change from desperation to dominance, from fragile defense to overwhelming pressure. As American industrial power surged, Enterprise did not fade into the background. She remained central. Through carrier task forces that swept across the Pacific, through battles where air power erased surface fleets before they could engage, Enterprise continued to launch strikes that isolated islands, shattered logistics, and denied the enemy any chance to recover balance. By the later stages of the war, the fighting grew more desperate. Kamikaze attacks replaced conventional assault. The damage became more frequent. Losses came closer to home. Enterprise survived all of it. She finished the war battered, scarred, and still operational. A floating testament to what sustained pressure looks like when it refuses to break. The history of USS Enterprise is not just a list of battles. It is the story of presence, of a ship that never allowed the enemy space to breathe, of a crew that lived inside the war until the war ran out of ground. She earned more battle honors than any other U.S. ship, not because she was perfect, but because she endured. Tonight, we follow that journey across the Pacific, from uncertainty to dominance, from survival to relentless pursuit, from the first carrier war to its final reckoning. This is the history of USS Enterprise, the ship that carried the war on her decks and never let it slip. Before we continue, let me pause for a moment and hear from you. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? And what time is it for you there? Is this a late night listen, an early morning start, or a quiet moment carved out just to sit with history? And if these long, immersive journeys into the past help you slow down, reflect, or feel connected to the people and machines that carried this war forward, I hope you'll consider subscribing. If this feels like a place you want to return to, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the story of USS Enterprise, October 3rd, 1933, Newport News, Virginia. The keel touches the building, way at 9:15 in the morning, a single piece of American steel that will become something the world has never quite seen before. Thousands of workers stand in the cavernous shipyard, watching as the first structural member of what will become USS Enterprise settles into place with a metallic groan that echoes off the walls. Most of them don't fully understand what they are building. The Navy has ordered an aircraft carrier, yes, but the concept itself remains more theory than proven weapon. In Washington, admirals who spent their entire careers on battleships look at the budget allocation with barely concealed skepticism, wondering if $18 million might be better spent on ships with guns that can actually reach an enemy. The shipyard workers don't concern themselves with strategic debates. They have jobs during the Depression, and that's miracle enough. Over the next 3 years, they will lay 95,000 tons of steel, all miles of electrical wiring, hundreds of compartments connected by passageways that twist through the ship's interior like a maze. The design comes from the Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair, incorporating lessons from earlier carriers Lexington and Saratoga, but everyone involved knows they're still guessing. How thick should the flight deck be? How much aviation fuel can you safely store below decks? What happens when a 20,000-pound aircraft lands at 70 miles per hour on a moving platform? The blueprints offer answers, but blueprints have never been tested by the chaos of actual combat. By October 3rd, 1936, the hull is complete enough to touch water. Eleanor Roosevelt stands at the bow with a champagne bottle, surrounded by 30,000 spectators who've come to watch the launch. The First Lady christens the ship Enterprise, the 7th American warship to carry that name, a lineage stretching back to the Revolutionary War. When the restraining blocks are knocked away, the massive hull slides down the ways into the James River, displacing enough water to create waves that rock the spectator boats anchored nearby. The crowd cheers, but the ship is still just a hollow steel shell, months away from having engines or the equipment that will make her a carrier. Workers will spend another 1.5 years installing the machinery that will transform this floating hull into a weapon. The propulsion system alone represents a gamble on new technology. 9 Babcock and Wilcox boilers feed steam to Westinghouse turbines that generate 120,000 shaft horsepower. That's what the engineers promise. This will push the ship to 32.5 knots, fast enough to keep pace with cruisers and destroyers, fast enough to run from battleships if necessary. But during the first sea trials in late 1938, things go wrong with alarming frequency. A turbine develops vibrations that threaten to shake the reduction gears apart. Fire breaks out in one of the boiler rooms when insulation ignites from the intense heat. An electrical fire in the hangar deck fills the interior spaces with toxic smoke. Captain Newton H. White, Jr., the first commanding officer, writes in his initial reports that the ship requires extensive modifications before she can be considered combat ready. The Navy has bet $18 million on a weapons platform that can barely complete a shakedown cruise without breaking down. The Air Group arrives in early 1939, and with them comes a new set of problems that nobody quite anticipated. The pilots are supposed to land on a flight deck that's 809 feet long, which sounds adequate until you watch a Douglas TBD Devastator approaching at 75 miles per hour with a relative closure speed that gives the pilot about 6 seconds to catch one of 9 arresting wires stretched across the deck. Miss all 9 wires and the aircraft slams into the barrier, or worse, goes over the side into the ocean. During the first month of flight operations, Enterprise loses 3 aircraft to landing accidents, 2 pilots killed, and the Air Group commander requests a meeting with Captain White to discuss whether carrier aviation might be inherently too dangerous to be practical. The meeting happens in White's cabin, a tense conversation where the Air Group commander suggests that perhaps the battleship admirals are right. Perhaps carriers are an expensive experiment that will never work in actual combat. White, to his credit, doesn't dismiss the concerns. He's a surface warfare officer who spent 25 years on cruisers and destroyers before receiving orders to command this strange hybrid vessel. He doesn't pretend to understand aviation the way the pilots do, but he recognizes that the problem isn't the concept, it's the execution. The landing signal officer needs better training. The flight deck crew needs to practice emergency procedures until they can respond without thinking. The pilots need more practice traps, more simulated emergency landings, more experience dealing with the ship's wake turbulence and the deck's pitch and roll in heavy seas. Over the next 6 months, Enterprise conducts endless training exercises off the California coast, slowly transforming from a ship that loses aircraft regularly to a ship that can conduct flight operations in conditions that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. By April 1939, Enterprise joins the Pacific Fleet in San Diego, and the Navy begins to understand what they've actually built. The ship can launch 90 aircraft in less than an hour, projecting American power across distances that no battleship gun can reach. The Air Group includes fighters, dive bombers, scout planes, and torpedo bombers, giving Enterprise capabilities that no single ship has ever possessed. During fleet exercises, Enterprise aircraft sink battleships that never see the carrier that launched the attack. Admiral Ernest King, who watches one of these exercises from the bridge of a battleship, sees his ship declared destroyed by bombs dropped from aircraft that appeared with no warning. He writes in his after-action report that the demonstration was impressive, but notes that the umpires were perhaps too generous in their assessment of bombing accuracy. The battleship admirals remain unconvinced. The crew that serves aboard Enterprise during these early years represents a cross-section of Depression-era America. Farm boys from Iowa who joined the Navy because there were no jobs at home. Kids from Philadelphia and Chicago who saw the recruitment posters promising adventure. A few Annapolis graduates who requested carrier duty because they believed aviation represented the future. They live in cramped berthing compartments where bunks are stacked 3 high and personal space means the few cubic feet around your bunk. The ship carries a crew of 2,900 men, and most of them have no real idea what combat will demand of them. They practice damage control drills and learn to fight fires in sealed compartments where the heat reaches lethal levels in minutes. They learn to sleep through the thunderous roar of aircraft launching overhead at 2 in the morning. They learn to function on 4 hours of sleep because the ship operates 24 hours a day, and there's always another watch to stand. The air group develops tactics through trial and error, sometimes fatal error. Lieutenant Commander Halstead Hopping, who commands the dive bomber squadron, pioneered techniques for coordinated attacks, where multiple aircraft hit a target simultaneously from different angles. The theory is sound, but executing it requires split-second timing and navigation that pushes both aircraft and pilots to their limits. During a training exercise in March 1941, 2 SBD Dauntless dive bombers collide at the bottom of their dive, killing both crews instantly. The accident investigation reveals that the pilots were trying to hit the same practice target within a 3-second window, and neither saw the other until it was too late. Hopping rewrites the tactical manual, adding separation requirements and better communication protocols. But the lesson is brutal. Carrier aviation kills people even in peacetime, and combat will be infinitely worse. By December 1941, Enterprise has been in commission for 3 years. She's crossed the Pacific dozens of times, conducted war games that simulated battles against Japan, and slowly evolved from an experimental platform into something approaching a genuine warship. But nobody really knows if she'll survive actual combat. The crew includes veterans with 3 years of experience and new sailors with 3 months. The air group has pilots who've made 500 carrier landings and pilots who've made 50. The ship herself has been modified repeatedly, adding equipment and removing it, strengthening structures that failed, and redesigning systems that didn't work. She's the most powerful carrier in the Pacific Fleet, which makes her invaluable. She's also untested in combat, which makes her greatest capabilities purely theoretical. In 9 days, that theory will be tested in ways nobody aboard her can possibly imagine. In 9 days, the world will discover whether an aircraft carrier can actually change the course of history, or whether the battleship admirals were right all along. November 28, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The anchor chain rattles up through the hawse pipe at 0800 hours, sounding like thunder across the harbor. Enterprise swings her bow toward the channel, engines building power, preparing to sortie into the Pacific for what everyone aboard believes is another routine ferry mission. Captain George Murray stands on the bridge wing, watching the other ships of Task Force 8 form up around him. 3 heavy cruisers, 9 destroyers, all 1 oiler trailing behind. Their mission is simple enough: deliver 12 Marine Corps F-4F Wildcat fighters to Wake Island, then return to Pearl in time for Christmas. Murray has made this run before. Wake sits 2,300 miles west of Hawaii, a tiny coral atoll that suddenly matters because the diplomats in Washington say war with Japan could come any day now. The Marines on Wake need fighters. Enterprise will deliver them. The crew doesn't know that Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, has already opened sealed orders that change everything. War Plan Orange, the Navy's strategy for conflict with Japan, calls for immediate offensive action against Japanese bases in the Marshall Islands. Task Force 8 isn't just delivering fighters. They're positioning Enterprise for a potential strike that could happen within days of war's outbreak. But Kimmel keeps this information restricted to senior officers, so most of Enterprise's crew believes they're conducting routine operations. Down in the hangar deck, aviation machinist mate 3rd Class Bruno Guido works on an SBD Dauntless dive bomber, checking the hydraulic system that operates the dive brakes. He's 21 years old, joined the Navy 2 years ago from Chicago, and he's never heard a shot fired in anger. In 9 days, that will change. The crossing takes 5 days at 22 knots, enough speed to keep the destroyers working hard, but not enough to exhaust the fuel supply. Life aboard a carrier at sea follows rhythms that have become automatic after 3 years of operations. Any flight operations begin at dawn with the launch of patrol aircraft, scouts that fly ahead of the task force looking for submarines or surface ships. The fighter squadron maintains a combat air patrol overhead throughout daylight hours, 2 or 3 F-4F Wildcats circling at 15,000 feet, practicing intercepts against imaginary enemy bombers. Below decks, the ship's company maintains the machinery that keeps Enterprise running, 1,200 men who work in engineering spaces where the temperature reaches 120 degrees, where the noise from the turbines makes conversation impossible without shouting directly into someone's ear. On December 2nd, Enterprise reaches Wake Island and launches the 12 Marine fighters. The handover takes 90 minutes, the Wildcats flying off Enterprise's deck for the last time. They're heading for Wake's crewed airstrip. Major Paul Putnam, commanding officer of Marine Fighting Squadron 211, knows these 12 fighters represent his entire air defense. He stands on Wake's beach, watching the Wildcats circle overhead, probably wondering if 12 fighters will be enough. Enterprise's crew watches the island disappear over the horizon astern, unaware that most of those Marine pilots will be dead in 2 weeks, killed defending Wake against overwhelming Japanese attacks. Captain Murray receives new orders via encrypted radio message, return to Pearl Harbor via a route 200 miles north of the direct path, conduct intensive anti-submarine patrols, maintain radio silence. The orders don't explain why, but the change in procedure tells experienced officers that something has shifted in the strategic situation. The return voyage develops a tension that wasn't present on the outbound leg. Enterprise maintains Condition 3, a heightened state of readiness where gun crews stay near their battle stations, and the ship can go to full battle stations within minutes. The combat air patrol flies more aggressively, pursuing radar contacts that turn out to be clouds or rain squalls. In the radio room, operators monitor Japanese naval frequencies, hearing increased traffic that suggests major fleet movements. Nobody can decrypt the messages, the Imperial Japanese Navy's codes remain unbroken, but the volume of traffic indicates something significant is happening. Admiral William Halsey, who commands Task Force 8 from Enterprise's flag bridge, then sends a message to all ships. Any Japanese aircraft or surface vessels encountered will be destroyed. The message circulates through Enterprise's ready rooms, where pilots realize they've just been given authorization to shoot first without waiting for a declaration of war. December 7th begins like any other day at sea. Enterprise is 200 miles west of Pearl Harbor, scheduled to arrive that afternoon. The morning launch goes smoothly. 18 SBD, Dauntless scout bombers, heading toward Pearl Harbor to conduct anti-submarine patrols around the approaches to the harbor. Lieutenant Commander Halstead Hopping leads the flight, planning to land at Ford Island's Naval Air Station to refuel before returning to Enterprise. The scouts depart at 06:15, climbing to altitude in the pre-dawn darkness, navigating by dead reckoning toward an island they expect to reach in 90 minutes. Behind them, Enterprise recovers the night patrol and prepares to launch another scouting mission. In the wardroom, officers eat breakfast and complain about missing the Sunday morning routine in Pearl Harbor. In the berthing compartments, sailors who aren't on watch sleep through the noise of flight operations overhead. In 3 hours, everything will change. At 08:10, the radio room receives a message from one of Enterprise's scout planes. Pearl Harbor under attack. This is no drill. The message repeats twice, then cuts off. On the bridge, Captain Murray orders general quarters, and the alarm bells shatter the morning calm. 2,900 men race to battle stations, the trained chaos of a ship going to full combat readiness. Watertight doors slam shut throughout the ship, dividing Enterprise into dozens of separate compartments that can be isolated if damage occurs. the 5-inch gun crews load their weapons and train them out, searching empty skies for targets. The fighter squadron launches, F-4, F-Wildcats roaring off the deck to establish a protective screen. Admiral Halsey appears on the flag bridge, face set in grim lines, demanding information that nobody has. The radio traffic from Pearl Harbor is garbled and contradictory. Reports of bombs and torpedoes and fires, but no clear picture of what's actually happening. Enterprise's scout bombers reach Pearl Harbor at 0830, flying into the middle of the Japanese attack. They arrive from the west, approaching Ford Island from the same direction as the Japanese strike aircraft, and the American gunners defending Pearl can't distinguish friendly aircraft from enemy aircraft in the chaos. Several SBDs are shot at by their own ships. Ensign Manuel Gonzalez radios that he's taking anti-aircraft fire, identifies himself as American, but the guns keep firing. Lieutenant, junior grade, Clarence Dickinson watches a Japanese Zero attach his wingman's SBD, sees the American aircraft catch fire and spiral into the harbor. He tries to fight back with his SBD's single forward-firing machine gun, but the Zero is faster and more maneuverable. 5 of Enterprise's scout bombers are shot down in the next 30 minutes, some by Japanese fighters, others by American anti-aircraft fire. 9 aircrew die, killed in the confused first minutes of a war that started without them knowing it had begun. By mid-afternoon, Enterprise is racing toward Pearl Harbor at maximum speed, ready to launch strikes against the Japanese fleet if it can be found. The Combat Air Patrol intercepts multiple radar contacts that turn out to be false alarms. The crew maintains full battle stations for 18 hours straight, waiting for an enemy that never appears. The Japanese carriers have already turned north, heading back to Japan, and Enterprise arrives too late to catch them. That night, exhausted sailors finally secure from battle stations and try to process what has happened. Down in the hangar deck, aviation machinist mate 3rd Class Bruno Guido helps repair the SBDs that return damage from Pearl Harbor. He sees the bullet holes in the wings and fuselage, sees the blood in one cockpit where a radio man was wounded. He's still never fired a shot at the enemy, but now he understands that the enemy is very real and very capable of killing him. Enterprise finally enters Pearl Harbor on the evening of December 8th. The crew lines the rails, staring at the devastation. Battleship Row is a nightmare of twisted metal and oil fires. Arizona is gone, blown apart by a magazine explosion that killed over 1,000 men in seconds. Oklahoma has capsized, her hull visible above the water like a beached whale. California and West Virginia are settling into the mud, sinking slowly. The smell of burning oil and death hangs over the harbor like a physical presence. Some of Enterprise's crew cry openly at the sight. Others stand silent, faces blank with shock. A few express anger, demanding to know when they'll get a chance to strike back. Captain Murray watches from the bridge, aches knowing that his ship has suddenly become infinitely more important. With the battleship fleet wrecked, the few remaining carriers now carry the burden of fighting a war nobody was quite ready for. Enterprise has been in commission for 3 years. In that time, she's become a competent, professional warship. Whether she can become a combat-effective warship capable of fighting the Imperial Japanese Navy remains an open question that will be answered very soon. February 1st, 1942. Task Force 8, 300 miles northeast of Kwajalein Atoll. The flight deck is alive with controlled chaos at 0430 in the morning, 54 hours after departing Pearl Harbor. Red lights illuminate the darkness as plane handlers push SBD Dauntless dive bombers into position for launch. E-37 aircraft will fly this mission, the first American offensive strike of the Pacific War, and every man on the flight deck knows they're about to do something that has never been done before. They're going to attack a Japanese base while America is losing everywhere else. Guam is gone. Wake Island fell on December 23rd. Manila is besieged. Singapore is collapsing. This raid on the Marshall Islands won't change the strategic situation, but it will prove that America can hit back. In the ready room, Lieutenant Commander Halstead Holping briefs the dive bomber pilots one final time. The target is Kwajalein Atoll, a major Japanese naval base 1,500 miles southwest of Hawaii. Intelligence estimates 20 to 30 ships in the anchorage, protected by anti-aircraft guns and fighter aircraft. Hans Hopping's voice is steady as he goes through the attack plan. Approach from the east at 15,000 feet. Push over into 70-degree dives at 12,000 feet. Release bombs at 2,000 feet. Pull out and return individually to Enterprise. Simple in theory, the pilots know it won't be simple in execution. Several of them have been vomiting from nerves for the past hour. Ensign John Bridges, 23 years old from Tennessee, sits in the back row and tries to remember everything he learned in flight school about dive bombing. He's made practice dives against target sleds towed behind destroyers, but he's never dropped a bomb while people were shooting at him. The launch begins at 05:15, precisely on schedule despite the darkness. The flight deck crew has done this hundreds of times in training, and now they do it for real with the same professional competence. Each SBD is spotted on the catapult. The engine runs up to full power. The pilot salutes the launch officer, and the catapult fires, hurling the 5-ton aircraft from 0 to 70 miles per hour in 70 feet. The noise is overwhelming, a continuous roar of engines that makes communication possible only through hand signals. Aviation machinists Mite Bruno Guido watches from the hangar deck, feeling the ship shudder with each catapult shot. He's part of the recovery crew that will handle the aircraft when they return. If they return. Nobody knows what the loss rate will be. During the planning sessions, some officers estimated 50% losses. Others thought that was pessimistic. Nobody really knows. The strike group assembles overhead in the darkness. Mite then turns southwest toward Kwajalein. The flight takes 90 minutes, the aircraft droning through the pre-dawn darkness at 160 miles per hour. As the sun rises behind them, the pilots see Roy Namur and Kwajalein Islands appear on the horizon, small green dots in the vast blue of the Pacific. The atolls look peaceful from altitude, but as they get closer, the pilots see ships everywhere: cruisers, destroyers, submarines, transports, oilers. The anchorage is packed with targets. Then the anti-aircraft fire begins, black puffs of smoke appearing around the formation as Japanese gunners find the range. The puffs seem almost lazy at first, drifting up slowly, but the pilots know each puff represents shrapnel that can shred an aircraft. Hopping takes the dive bombers down first, rolling inverted and pulling through into the near-vertical dive that gives the SBD its name, Scout Bomber Douglas. The world compresses into tunnel vision as the altimeter unwinds and the target rushes up at horrifying speed. At 2,000 feet, Hopping releases his 1,000-pound bomb, pulls back on the stick with both hands, and the SBD shudders through a 6G pullout that grays out his vision. Behind him, the other dive bombers follow one after another, each pilot trying to remember the procedures while dealing with anti-aircraft fire that fills the sky with metal. Ensign John Bridges pushes over into his dive, sees a transport ship in his bomb sight, feels the aircraft shaking as it accelerates past 250 miles per hour. He releases, pulls out, and his radio man yells through the intercom that they've been hit. The right wing is shredded, control cables visible through holes in the aluminum skin. Bridges tries to maintain altitude, but the damaged wing creates asymmetric lift that pulls the aircraft into a spiral. He fights the controls, manages to level out at 5,000 feet, but the engine is running rough and losing power. The coast is 20 miles behind them now, and Bridges realizes they're not going to make it back to Enterprise. The engine seizes completely at 1,000 feet. Bridges has time to radio a mayday before the aircraft hits the water, hard enough to collapse the landing gear. The SBD floats for perhaps 30 seconds, long enough for Bridges and his radio man to get out of the cockpit. Then the aircraft sinks, disappearing into water that's 3,000 feet deep. Yes, they're 15 miles from Japanese-held islands with no survival gear except life jackets. An Enterprise destroyer will search for them for 6 hours before giving up. They are the first Enterprise aircrew killed in combat, but not the last. The torpedo bombers go in next, TBD Devastators that approach at wave-top height, trying to get under the anti-aircraft fire. The Devastator is obsolete before the war even started. Top speed 115 miles per hour when carrying a torpedo, painfully slow and vulnerable. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay leads Torpedo Squadron 6 toward a Japanese cruiser, flying 50 feet above the water, while Japanese gunners track them with terrifying accuracy. The air is full of tracers, bright lines of light that converge on the slow-moving torpedo bombers. A 1 TBD takes a direct hit and explodes, pieces of aircraft and crew scattering across the water. Lindsay's aircraft is hit repeatedly, but somehow stays in the air long enough to release its torpedo. He pulls up and away, counting 3 other TBDs making it through, but knows at least half his squadron has been lost in the attack run that lasted less than 5 minutes. By 0900 hours, the attack is over, and the aircraft are heading back to Enterprise. The pilots compare notes over the radio, trying to assess what they accomplished. They saw ships burning, counted at least 5 hits on major vessels, watched explosions tear through a submarine tender. But they also saw friends die, watched aircraft disintegrate under anti-aircraft fire, experienced the reality that war kills people in ways that are random and terrifying. Yet the return flight seems longer than the inbound leg, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving exhausted pilots fighting to maintain formation. Several aircraft are so badly damaged that the pilots consider ditching near Enterprise rather than risking a landing, but the ship's crew needs these aircraft, so they try anyway. The recovery takes 2 hours and includes several near disasters. One SBD's hydraulics are shot out, forcing a barrier crash that destroys the aircraft, but leaves the crew shaken but alive. Another SBD's tailhook fails to catch the arresting wire, and the aircraft goes into the barrier, crumpling the propeller and crushing the engine cowling. The ship's crew swarms over each damaged aircraft as it lands, pulling it off the landing area and below to the hangar deck, where repair crews can assess the damage. The aviation machinist's mate, Bruno Guido, works on one SBD that has 73 holes from anti-aircraft shrapnel. Some of the holes are small enough to patch with aluminum plate. Others go through structural members that will require major repair back at Pearl Harbor. While he works, other sailors carry body bags to the sickbay, the remains of radio men and gunners killed during the attack. That evening, Admiral Halsey assembles the air group in the hangar deck for a debriefing. He congratulates them on the first American offensive of the war, tells them they sank 3 ships and damaged 5 more, destroyed 8 aircraft on the ground at Roy Namur Airfield. The pilots know the numbers are probably optimistic. Battle damage assessments always are, but they also know they accomplished something. More importantly, they survived. The loss rate was 16%, 6 aircraft and 11 aircrew. Painful, but not the 50% some pessimists predicted. Halsey tells them this is just the beginning, that Enterprise will hit the Japanese again and again until they regret attacking Pearl Harbor. The crew cheers, but many of them are thinking about the friends who didn't come back. Down in the hangar deck, Bruno Guido finishes his shift and heads to his berthing compartment. He lies in his bunk, listening to the ship's ventilation system, thinking about the bullet holes he patched today. In 6 weeks, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, he'll have his own chance to shoot at Japanese aircraft. But tonight, he's just a 22-year-old kid from Chicago who's beginning to understand what this war is going to cost. April 2nd, 1942. Pier 2. Alameda Naval Air Station, San Francisco. Enterprise crew members line the rails, watching something impossible happen 300 yards away. 16B-25. Mitchell bombers, massive twin-engine Army aircraft, are being loaded aboard USS Hornet using cranes that strain under the weight. Each bomber weighs 15 tons and has a wingspan of 67 feet, dimensions that seem absurd for carrier operations. The B-25s are supposed to operate from runways measured in thousands of feet, not the 809-foot flight deck of an aircraft carrier. Enterprise's pilots watch with professional skepticism, trying to figure out what kind of mission would require Army bombers on a Navy carrier. The rumors spreading through the ship range from plausible to absurd. They're going to bomb Wake Island to support a Marine invasion. They're going to attack Japanese bases in the Marshalls. They're going to do something so classified that even talking about it could get you court-martialed. The truth, which only a handful of officers know, is simultaneously simpler and more audacious than the rumors. The B-25s are going to bomb Tokyo. The plan was developed by Navy Captain Francis Lowe and approved by Admiral Ernest King, despite skepticism from almost everyone who heard it. Army bombers will launch from a carrier, bomb Japanese cities, then fly to friendly airfields in China because they can't land back on the carrier. It's a one-way mission that violates about a dozen standard operating procedures, and the pilots flying it are all volunteers who understand they might not survive. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a legendary Army aviator, commands the mission. He's 55 years old enough to be the father of most of his pilots, and he's going to lead from the front because that's the only way he knows how to command. Enterprise and Hornet sortie on April 13th, forming Task Force 16, along with 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 oilers. The task force represents a significant portion of the Pacific Fleet's remaining combat power. 2 of the Navy's 4 operational carriers, steaming together toward Japan, despite the doctrine that says carriers should never operate together because losing both in a single action would be catastrophic. Admiral Halsey commands from Enterprise, and he's accepted the risk because the potential reward justifies it. Hitting Tokyo won't change the strategic situation. Japan will still control most of the Western Pacific, but it will prove that Japan is vulnerable and give American morale a boost it desperately needs after 4 months of unrelenting defeats. The voyage across the Pacific takes 6 days, and the security around the mission is absolute. Enterprise's crew knows Hornet is carrying Army bombers. Everyone can see them tied down on Hornet's flight deck. But the destination remains classified until April 18th. The fighter squadron maintains combat air patrol throughout daylight hours. 4 F-4F Wildcats orbiting overhead at 15,000 feet, ready to intercept any Japanese patrol aircraft that might spot the task force. The radio operators monitor Japanese frequencies, listening for any indication that the Americans have been detected. The ships maintain strict emission control, no radar transmissions that might be picked up by Japanese listening stations, navigation by dead reckoning and celestial observation. The task force is trying to cross 3,000 miles of ocean without being detected. A nearly impossible task in an era when long-range reconnaissance aircraft can search hundreds of miles. April 18th begins with contact. At 0600 hours, a lookout on USS Hornet spots a small vessel on the horizon. It's the Nidomaru, a Japanese picket boat stationed 650 miles east of Tokyo as an early warning outpost. The picket boat spots the American task force at the same moment and begins transmitting radio messages. While the cruiser USS Northampton opens fire, 5-inch guns sending shells screaming across the water at the small wooden vessel. The Nidomaru is sunk, but not before transmitting multiple contact reports. Admiral Halsey faces an immediate decision: abort the mission or launch early. The plan called for launching 400 miles from Tokyo, close enough that the B-25s would have enough fuel to reach China. Now they're 650 miles out, which means the bombers will be operating at the extreme edge of their range. Some might not make it, but aborting means returning to Pearl Harbor having accomplished nothing, and Halsey didn't become an admiral by being cautious. At 0720, the order goes out: launch aircraft. On Hornet's flight deck, Navy personnel scramble to prepare the B-25s for takeoff. The bombers are packed so tightly on deck that they can't taxi, so the first bomber must take off from the stern. Then each subsequent bomber can move forward into launch position. Doolittle's aircraft is first, the bomber positioned with less than 500 feet of deck ahead of it. Navy personnel line the deck edges, watching to see if an Army bomber can actually take off from a carrier. Doolittle runs up both engines to full power, releases the brakes, and the B-25 lurches forward, accelerating slowly on the pitching deck. Enterprise's crew, watching from 300 yards away, sees the bomber reach the end of the deck, dip below the flight deck level as it falls off the bow, then climb slowly into the air. The crew erupts in cheers. It's possible. Over the next 60 minutes, that all 16 B-25s launch successfully, a tribute to both Army piloting skill and Navy deck crew competence. Enterprise maintains combat air patrol during the launch, fighters circling overhead, ready to intercept any Japanese aircraft that might appear. The bombers form up and head west toward Japan, while Task Force 16 turns east and runs for Pearl Harbor at maximum speed. Admiral Halsey knows that Japanese carriers are somewhere in the Western Pacific, possibly close enough to counterattack, and he has no intention of risking both Enterprise and Hornet in a slugging match. The mission was to launch the bombers. That's accomplished. Now the task force needs to survive. The return voyage is tense. Enterprise maintains heightened readiness. Gun crews at battle stations. Fighters launching and recovering every few hours to maintain air cover. The radio room monitors Japanese frequencies, hearing increased traffic that suggests the Japanese are trying to locate the American task force. On April 19th, a PBY Catalina flying boat from Midway reports sighting a Japanese carrier 200 miles north of the task force's position. Halsey orders a course change to the south, maintaining 25 knots, hoping to open the distance before the Japanese can attack. The crew spends another night at battle stations, exhausted men catching sleep at their posts, waiting for the battle that never comes. By April 21st, Task Force 16 is far enough east that the Japanese can't catch them, and the crew finally secures from battle stations. USS Enterprise returns to Pearl Harbor on April 25th to a hero's welcome, despite the fact that Enterprise's crew didn't actually bomb anything. They protected Hornet. They got the Army bombers within range of Tokyo. They completed a mission that military historians will later recognize as one of the most important morale operations of the entire war. But for Enterprise's air group, there's a bitter undercurrent to the celebration. They trained for months to attack Japanese targets, and when the attack finally came, it was Army pilots who got to bomb Tokyo, while Navy pilots flew combat air patrol. Lieutenant Commander Halstead Hopping, who led the Marshall Islands raid and expected to lead strikes against Japan, feels the frustration most acutely. He's a professional naval aviator who wants to take the war to the enemy, and instead, he spent the operation protecting another carrier. Aviation machinist mate Bruno Guido works in the hangar deck during the return to Pearl, maintaining the SBD, Dauntless dive bombers that didn't get used. He's become friends with several of the pilots, young officers just a few years older than him, and he hears their complaints about missing the action. But Guido has a different perspective. He saw what anti-aircraft fire did to aircraft during the Marshall Islands raid. He's patched bullet holes and helped remove dead radio men from aircraft that made it back. He understands that glory and death often arrive together, and there's no shame in completing a mission without having to shoot or be shot at. In 2 months, at the Battle of Midway, Guido will get his chance to fight. He'll man a machine gun and shoot down a Japanese aircraft, and he'll discover that combat is nothing like he imagined. But for now, he's just grateful that everyone from Enterprise came home alive, something that won't always be true in the months ahead. May 11th, 1942. Coral Sea, 200 miles southeast of Guadalcanal. Enterprise cuts through water still stained with oil from USS Lexington, sunk 3 days earlier in the first carrier versus carrier battle in naval history. The crew lines the rails, staring at the debris field that stretches for miles. Life rafts, wooden crates, oil drums, life jackets, and pieces of aircraft floating among the slick. Somewhere below this surface lies Lexington, settling into water more than 2 miles deep. Carrying 216 men who didn't make it off before the fires consumed the ship. Enterprise arrived too late to participate in the Battle of the Coral Sea, too late to help Lexington, too late to affect the outcome. The ship raced south from Pearl Harbor at 27 knots for 6 days, pushing the engineering plant to its limits, and missed the battle by 48 hours. The frustration is palpable throughout the ship. Admiral Halsey paces the flag bridge, reading the after-action reports from Yorktown and trying to understand exactly what happened. The reports tell a confusing story of aircraft launched in groups that never coordinated properly, of dive bombers attacking separately from torpedo bombers, of American aircraft shot down in numbers that seem impossibly high. As Yorktown sank the light carrier Shoho and damaged the fleet carrier Shokaku, but lost 66 aircraft and 66 aircrew doing it. Lexington sank after being hit by 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs, killed not by the initial damage but by aviation fuel vapor that exploded hours later, triggering fires that overwhelmed the damage control parties. The casualty numbers are sobering. 216 dead on Lexington, 66 aircraft lost from both carriers, an attrition rate of over 33% in a single battle. On May 13th, Enterprise receives survivors from Lexington's air group. The transfer happens at sea, Lexington's executive officer, and 200 crew members shuttling over on destroyers that come alongside Enterprise in calm seas. The survivors bring nothing but the clothes they're wearing and stories about how fast a carrier can die. Lieutenant Commander Bob Dixon, who commanded Lexington's Scout Bomber Squadron, briefs Enterprise's air group about the battle. He describes the coordinated Japanese strike that hit Lexington, torpedo bombers attacking from both sides simultaneously, while dive bombers attacked from above, overwhelming the defenses through sheer numbers and perfect timing. The Enterprise pilots listen carefully, taking notes, asking questions about Japanese tactics and aircraft performance. The tactical lessons from Coral Sea are harsh, but clear. First, coordinated strikes work and piecemeal attacks get slaughtered. Lexington and Yorktown launched their aircraft separately, arriving over the Japanese carriers at different times, thus allowing the Japanese Combat Air Patrol to concentrate on each group individually. The result was high American losses for modest results. Second, fighter direction remains primitive compared to Japanese capabilities. American carriers have radar that can detect incoming raids at 50 miles, but the fighter directors don't have effective procedures for vectoring interceptors to the right altitude and position. Japanese aircraft repeatedly penetrated the Combat Air Patrol because American fighters were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Third, the TBD Devastator torpedo bomber is a death trap. The Devastator's top speed of 115 miles per hour makes it easy prey for Japanese fighters, and at Coral Sea, the Japanese shot down so many torpedo bombers that the survivors questioned whether torpedo attacks were even possible against alert defenses. Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Enterprise's air group commander, spends the return voyage to Pearl Harbor, studying the Coral Sea after-action reports obsessively. McCluskey is a Naval Academy graduate who's been flying since 1935, and he understands that Enterprise is going to face the same Japanese carriers that fought at Coral Sea, probably soon. He writes new tactical doctrines, incorporating the lessons, distributing them to squadron commanders with orders to study and practice. The dive bombers and torpedo bombers will coordinate their attacks, hitting the target simultaneously from different directions. The Fighter Direction Center will maintain better communication with the Combat Air Patrol, providing altitude and heading information that might allow interception before the enemy reaches attack position. The air group will practice these new tactics until they become automatic, because the next battle won't allow time for consultation or discussion. The engineering staff studies Lexington's damage control reports with equal intensity. The ship's chief engineer, Commander Emmett Riera, calls a meeting of all division officers to discuss what killed Lexington. The answer is uncomfortably clear: aviation fuel vapor. Lexington's aviation fuel system was ruptured by torpedo hits, allowing fuel vapor to accumulate in spaces below the hangar deck. Hours after the attack, a spark from a generator ignited the vapor, causing an explosion that started fires the crew couldn't control. Enterprise has the same fuel system design, the same vulnerabilities. Riera orders immediate modifications, better ventilation in spaces adjacent to the fuel tanks, additional firefighting equipment positioned near high-risk areas, new procedures for isolating and purging fuel vapor after damage. The modifications won't eliminate the risk, but they might reduce it enough to make survival possible. By May 26th, Enterprise arrives back at Pearl Harbor, having spent 3 weeks at sea and accomplished exactly nothing. The crew is exhausted, frustrated, and increasingly aware that the Japanese have momentum. In 6 months of war, Japan has conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and numerous Pacific islands. The Battle of the Coral Sea was a tactical Japanese victory. Lexington sunk versus Shoho sunk, though strategically the Americans turned back the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby. But turning back one invasion doesn't change the overall situation. Japan is winning, and America's carrier strength has just dropped from 4 operational carriers to 3, with one of those 3, Yorktown, significantly damaged. The intelligence briefing on May 27th changes everything. Commander Joseph Rochefort, head of Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, has partially broken the Japanese naval code, JN-25. The intercepts indicate that Japan is planning a major operation against a target identified as AF in early June. Rochefort believes AF is Midway Island, a strategic atoll 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii. More importantly, that the intercepts suggest the Japanese are committing nearly their entire carrier force to the operation, 4 or possibly 5 fleet carriers, plus supporting battleships and cruisers. This is the decisive battle the Navy has been anticipating since the war began, the chance to face the Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier striking force that attacked Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, makes a strategic gamble that will define the Pacific War. He orders every available carrier to Midway, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, despite the latter's damage from Coral Sea. 3 American carriers against 4 or 5 Japanese carriers are not favorable odds, but they're better than the alternative. If the Japanese take Midway, they'll have a base within striking range of Hawaii, making Pearl Harbor untenable. Worse, if the American carriers don't fight at Midway, the Japanese will continue to dominate the Pacific for another year, while America builds new carriers. Nimitz decides to fight at Midway with what he has, accepting the risk that he might lose all 3 carriers, because not fighting guarantees Japanese victory. Enterprise has less than 2 weeks to prepare for the most important battle in American naval history. The ship enters dry dock for emergency repairs to battle damage that hasn't been properly addressed since the Marshall Islands raid 4 months earlier. The crew works around the clock loading ammunition, provisions, and aviation fuel. The air group conducts intensive flight training, practicing the coordinated dive bomber and torpedo attacks that McCluskey designed after studying Coral Sea. New pilots arrive from training commands stateside, fresh-faced kids with 300 hours of flight time, who will be expected to fight against Japanese veterans with thousands of hours. The veterans try to teach them everything they know in the few days available, but everyone understands that nothing truly prepares you for combat except combat itself. On May 28th, Enterprise departs Pearl Harbor for the last time before Midway. The ship passes through the channel in darkness, running without lights, heading northwest at 25 knots toward a rendezvous point designated Point Luck. Admiral Raymond Spruance now commands Task Force 16 from Enterprise's flag bridge, replacing Halsey, who's hospitalized with a severe skin condition. Spruance is a cruiser admiral with no aviation experience. The and Enterprise's crew doesn't know what to expect from him. Halsey was aggressive, willing to take risks, eager to attack. Spruance is cautious, analytical, methodical. Over the next week, he'll prove that cautious and analytical commanders can win battles just as decisively as aggressive ones, possibly more decisively because they don't make reckless mistakes. But on May 28th, all anyone knows is that Enterprise is sailing toward a battle that could end the war or lose it, and nobody is quite certain which outcome is more likely. May 30th, 1942. Task Force 16, 400 miles northeast of Midway Island. The ocean is empty in every direction, which is exactly what Admiral Raymond Spruance wants. Enterprise and Hornet, steam in loose formation, destroyers prowling the perimeter, radar operators staring at their scopes for any contact that might indicate Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. The task force is hunting, but also hiding, trying to position itself northeast of Midway where the Japanese won't expect American carriers to be. Intelligence says the Japanese fleet will approach from the northwest, planning to launch strikes against Midway on June 4th. That gives Task Force 16 5 days to prepare for a battle that will determine whether America can contest Japanese control of the Pacific or whether the war is already effectively lost. Spruance is a different kind of commander than Halsey, and Enterprise's crew is still adjusting to his style. Where Halsey would appear on the flight deck to give rousing speeches to the air group, Spruance stays on the flag bridge, studying charts and intelligence summaries, calculating fuel states and aircraft ranges with mathematical precision. He's 55 years old, a 1906 Naval Academy graduate who spent his entire career on battleships and cruisers until this assignment. He doesn't pretend to understand carrier aviation the way Halsey did, and he's honest about that limitation. But he understands mathematics, and he understands that this battle will be won by whichever side makes fewer mistakes. His tactical guidance to Captain George Murray and Air Group Commander Wade McCluskey is simple. Hit the Japanese carriers while they're rearming their aircraft, when their flight decks are covered with fueled and armed aircraft that can turn the ships into floating bombs. McCluskey takes Spruance's guidance and translates it into something the pilots can execute. He's 41 years old, older than most of the men he commands, and he's got a reputation as a demanding perfectionist who accepts nothing less than professional excellence. Over the next 3 days, he drills the air group relentlessly on coordinated attacks. The dive bombers and torpedo bombers will launch separately, but time their arrivals over the target so they hit simultaneously. The torpedo bombers will attack from opposite sides, forcing the Japanese carriers to maneuver in ways that make them vulnerable to dive bombers attacking from above. The fighter escort will protect the strike group on the way in, then engage Japanese fighters over the target to give the bombers clear runs. It's complicated, while requiring split-second timing and navigation precision that's difficult under ideal conditions, and nearly impossible in combat when people are shooting at you. The intelligence briefings continue throughout the voyage, and the picture becomes clearer and more frightening with each update. Station Hypo's codebreakers have identified 4 Japanese fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. These are the carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, that have been operating together since the war began, whose air groups have been in continuous combat since 1937. The Japanese have 248 aircraft versus the Americans' 233, but the quality gap is more important than the numbers. Japanese pilots have thousands of hours of combat experience. Many American pilots have none. Though the Japanese Zero fighter is superior to the American F-4F Wildcat in speed, climb rate, and maneuverability, the American TBD Devastator torpedo bomber is obsolete and slow. The only American advantage is the SBD Dauntless dive bomber, which is rugged, accurate, and effective when it can reach its target without being intercepted. On June 1st, Yorktown arrives at Point Luck, the rendezvous position northeast of Midway. Enterprise's crew lines the rails to look at their sister ship, and what they see is both inspiring and terrifying. Yorktown was hit by bombs at Coral Sea just 27 days ago, suffered damage that should have required 3 months in a Navy yard to repair properly. Instead, the Pearl Harbor repair crews worked around the clock for 72 hours, welding steel plates over the bomb holes, or replacing destroyed equipment with whatever was available, getting the ship operational enough to fight one more battle. Yorktown still shows visible damage, her flight deck patched with wooden planks where the bomb penetrated. But she's here, and she's ready. 3 American carriers against 4 Japanese carriers. Not good odds, but better than 2 against 4. Spruance briefs the carrier captains on June 2nd, laying out the tactical plan with characteristic precision. The task force will maintain position northeast of Midway, staying beyond the range of Japanese search aircraft. American patrol planes based on Midway will locate the Japanese fleet and provide contact reports. When the Japanese launch their attack on Midway, their carriers will be vulnerable during the recovery and rearming cycle that follows. That's when the American carriers will strike, hitting the enemy when their flight decks are cluttered with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Timing is everything. Launch too early, and the American aircraft will miss the vulnerable window. Launch too late, and the Japanese will have rearmed and be ready to launch their own strike against the American carriers. Spruance estimates the window of vulnerability will last about 30 minutes. In that 30-minute window, American dive bombers need to find 4 carriers spread across miles of ocean and destroy them before they can counterattack. The fighter squadron practices intercepts, climbing to 20,000 feet and diving on imaginary enemy bombers, trying to develop tactics that will allow the slower F-4F Wildcats to compete with faster Zeros. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, and commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3 from Yorktown, has developed a defensive weaving maneuver that allows Wildcats to cover each other's tails, but it requires discipline and communication that's difficult to maintain in the chaos of combat. Thatch briefs the other fighter squadrons on his tactics, and Enterprise's fighter pilots try to absorb lessons that might keep them alive. But everyone knows that fighter tactics have limitations. The TBD Devastator torpedo bombers are so slow that no amount of fighter escort will protect them once they start their attack runs. The torpedo bombers are going to take terrible losses, and the pilots who fly them know it. Down in the hangar deck, the maintenance crews work 72-hour shifts preparing aircraft for battle. Now, aviation machinist's mate Bruno Guido has been awake for 36 hours straight, checking and rechecking the hydraulic systems on SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Each aircraft has thousands of parts that can fail, and a failure during combat can mean death for the crew. Guido and his fellow mechanics inspect every rivet, every wire, every hose, looking for problems that might not matter during training, but become catastrophic in combat. They test the dive brakes that slow the aircraft during the near-vertical dives. They check the bomb release mechanisms that must work perfectly, or the bomb stays attached to the aircraft during the pullout. They inspect the radio equipment that pilots use to communicate with the ship and each other. It's unglamorous work done in cramped spaces that smell of hydraulic fluid and aviation fuel, but it's as important as any pilot's skill. The air group gathers in the ready rooms on the evening of June 3rd for final briefings. McCluskey stands at the front of Bombing Squadron 6's ready room, looking at 32 pilots who range in age from 21 to 35. Some of them flew at the Marshall Islands and saw combat for the first time. Others are fresh from training commands stateside and have never been shot at. McCluskey tells them that tomorrow they're going to attack the most powerful carrier force ever assembled, and that some of them won't come back. He doesn't sugarcoat it, doesn't offer false optimism, just states the facts clearly. Then he tells them that if they do their jobs correctly, they'll change the course of the war. The Japanese have been winning for 6 months because they have more carriers and better trained pilots. If Enterprise's air group can sink even one Japanese carrier tomorrow, the balance begins to shift. If they can sink 2 or more, the Pacific War becomes a contest instead of a Japanese conquest. Sleep doesn't come easily that night for most of Enterprise's crew. Some men write letters to families back home, letters that will be mailed only if they don't survive. Others gather in small groups to talk about anything, except the battle, trying to maintain normalcy in circumstances that are anything but normal. The ship's cooks prepare what might be the last hot meal many of the crew will eat, serving steak and eggs to the pilots at 0300 hours on June 4th. It's a tradition borrowed from the British Royal Navy. A condemned man's breakfast, though nobody says that out loud. The pilots eat mechanically, knowing they need the calories, but tasting nothing, thinking about the flight that starts in 4 hours. By 0400 hours, Enterprise is at battle stations. Every man at his post, the ship divided into separate watertight compartments that can be sealed if damage occurs. The flight deck crew begins spotting aircraft for launch, positioning 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers at the stern, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers amidships, 10 F-4, F Wildcat fighters forward. The choreography requires precise timing because there's no room for error on a flight deck that's 809 feet long and 96 feet wide. One mistake, one aircraft that doesn't start, one brake failure, and the entire launch can be delayed or canceled. The yellow-shirted plane directors guide each aircraft into position using hand signals that are clear even in darkness. The red-shirted ordnance crew loads 1,000-pound bombs onto the dive bombers, their work illuminated by red lights that don't destroy night vision. The brown-shirted plane captains perform final checks, testing controls, checking tire pressure, ensuring nothing has been overlooked. Admiral Spruant stands on the flag bridge, watching the launch preparations and waiting for the patrol plane contact report that will tell him where the Japanese carriers are. He's calculated the geometry of the battle dozens of times, working out fuel consumption rates and aircraft speeds and time-distance problems with the obsessive attention to detail that defines his command style. He knows that Enterprise's SBD Dauntless dive bombers have a combat radius of 175 miles, which means they can attack targets up to 175 miles away and still have enough fuel to return. He knows that the TBD Devastator torpedo bombers have a combat radius of 150 miles and that they burn fuel faster than the dive bombers. He knows that launching early gives him more time to find the enemy, but also means his aircraft might miss the vulnerable window when Japanese carriers are rearming. Launch late and his aircraft might arrive too late, after the Japanese have launched their own strike. Spruance has done the mathematics, but mathematics can't account for the 1,000 variables that make war unpredictable. In 2 hours, and he'll have to make a decision based on incomplete information, and that decision will determine whether Task Force 16 survives the day. June 4th, 1942, 0702 hours, 175 miles northeast of the Japanese carrier force. The catapult fires and Wade McCluskey's SBD, Dauntless hurls forward, accelerating from 0 to 70 miles per hour in 3 seconds. The sudden force crushes McCluskey back into his seat as his aircraft clears the bow and he eases the stick forward, trading altitude for airspeed, building to 120 knots before beginning a slow climb. Behind him, Enterprise's flight deck crew launches the rest of Bombing Squadron 6 and Scouting Squadron 6, 33 dive bombers total, the largest strike group Enterprise has ever launched. McCluskey circles overhead, watching the other SBDs form up, counting aircraft, checking for stragglers. The launch has already taken longer than planned. The fighters launched first, but climbed too fast, burning fuel while waiting for the slower dive bombers. The torpedo bombers are still launching, their obsolete TBD Devastators struggling to get airborne with the weight of a torpedo. The coordination McCluskey planned for weeks is already falling apart, and they haven't even left sight of Enterprise. Fighting Squadron 6, the fighter escort, is supposed to rendezvous with the dive bombers and torpedo bombers. Then the entire group will fly to the target together. But the fighters are at 15,000 feet burning fuel. The dive bombers are at 12,000 feet still forming up. And the torpedo bombers are down at 2,000 feet, so slow and heavy they can't climb to altitude. McCluskey makes a decision that will haunt him for years afterward. He takes the dive bombers toward the target without waiting for the torpedo bombers or confirming that the fighters are in position. It's a violation of the coordinated attack doctrine, but waiting any longer means burning fuel the SBDs will need to return to Enterprise. At 0720, McCluskey leads 33 dive bombers southwest toward the last known position of the Japanese carriers, hoping the fighters and torpedo bombers will catch up. The flight to the target takes 90 minutes. 90 minutes of flying over empty ocean with nothing to see except water in every direction. McCluskey navigates by dead reckoning, compensating for wind drift, maintaining a heading that should bring his aircraft to the Japanese carrier's estimated position. He's flying the mission the same way he's flown hundreds of training missions, professionally and methodically, but there's a knot in his stomach that has nothing to do with air sickness. At 0920, the dive bombers reach the position where intelligence said the Japanese carriers would be. The ocean below is empty. No carriers, no destroyers, no ships of any kind. McCluskey rechecks his navigation, confirms his heading and distance, and accepts the possibility that either the intelligence was wrong or the Japanese carriers changed course after launching their attack on Midway. He has a decision to make, and fuel state is becoming critical. The SBD Dauntless carries 210 gallons of fuel in internal tanks. Now McCluskey's aircraft has been airborne for 2 hours and 20 minutes, and his fuel gauge shows 90 gallons remaining. That's enough to fly for perhaps 45 minutes at cruise power, maybe an hour if he leans the mixture and accepts reduced speed. He can turn back toward Enterprise right now and land with a comfortable fuel reserve, or he can continue searching, gambling that he can find the Japanese carriers before fuel exhaustion forces him to ditch in the ocean. If he turns back, the mission fails and the Japanese retain their carrier superiority. If he continues searching and doesn't find the carriers, 33 dive bombers will run out of fuel and ditch, killing most of the crews. It's a command decision that offers no good options. McCluskey makes the decision that will later be called the most important command decision by an air group commander in American naval history. He extends the search southwest, the direction the Japanese carriers would be heading if they were returning toward their main fleet after attacking Midway. He doesn't tell the other pilots about fuel state, doesn't mention that this decision might kill them all, just gives the order to follow him and turns southwest. 5 minutes pass. 10 minutes. The fuel gauges continue their steady drop toward empty. McCluskey's radio man, Warrant Officer Walter Chochalusek, taps him on the shoulder and points at the fuel gauge, a silent question about whether they're going to ditch. McCluskey shakes his head and keeps flying. At 10:05, 15 minutes after extending the search, McCluskey spots a destroyer wake below. The ship is traveling at high speed, heading northwest, throwing up a white wake that's visible from 30 miles away. The destroyer is Arashi, racing to rejoin the Japanese carrier force after spending 2 hours dropping depth charges on USS Nautilus. an American submarine that attempted to attack the carriers. The destroyer's captain doesn't know he's leading American aircraft directly to the target he's supposed to protect. McCluskey follows the wake, and at 10:20, he sees them. 4 Japanese carriers spread across miles of ocean, flight decks covered with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. He's found the most important targets in the Pacific Ocean, and through a combination of skill, determination, and extraordinary luck, he's arrived at the exact moment when they're most vulnerable. The Japanese carriers are preparing to launch a second wave against Midway when McCluskey's dive bombers appear overhead. The carriers' flight decks are cluttered with aircraft, fuel hoses stretched across the deck, ordnance carts positioned next to aircraft where ground crews are loading bombs. It's the scenario Spruance described, the 30-minute window of maximum vulnerability, and McCluskey has arrived at minute 15 of that window. He identifies the 2 nearest carriers, Keiga and Akagi, the flagships of the Kido Butai, and divides his force. Bombing Squadron 6 will attack Keiga. Scouting Squadron 6 will attack Akagi. He gives the signal and rolls inverted, pulling through into a 70-degree dive that points his SBD directly at Kaga's flight deck, 12,000 feet below. The dive takes 30 seconds from initiation to bomb release, 30 seconds during which McCluskey's airspeed builds past 250 miles per hour, and the ship below expands from a small rectangle to a massive target that fills his bomb site. Japanese anti-aircraft fire fills the sky with black puffs of shrapnel, but the gunners can't track aircraft in near vertical dives. McCluskey's bomb leaves the aircraft at 2,000 feet, and he pulls back on the stick with both hands, the G-forces graying out his vision as the SBD shudders through the pullout. He doesn't see his bomb hit, too busy flying, but his radio man reports a direct hit on Kaga's flight deck forward of the island. Behind McCluskey, the other dive bombers from Bombing Squadron 6 follow one after another, releasing their 1,000-pound bombs in sequence. If 3 bombs hit Kaga, exploding among the fueled and armed aircraft on the flight deck, starting fires that spread instantly through aviation fuel and ammunition. 300 yards to the north, Scouting Squadron 6 attacks Akagi with similar results. Lieutenant Richard Best leads his 3-aircraft section through the anti-aircraft fire, releases his bomb at 2,000 feet, and watches it penetrate Akagi's flight deck amidships, exploding in the hangar deck, where more fueled aircraft are waiting to be lifted to the flight deck. The explosion triggers secondary explosions as aircraft fuel tanks rupture and ammunition cooks off. Within minutes, both Akagi and Kaga are burning out of control, their flight decks ripped apart by bombs and secondary explosions, fires spreading faster than damage control parties can contain them. Enterprise's dive bombers have just achieved what 6 months of American defeats couldn't accomplish. They've crippled the core of Japan's carrier striking force. But McCluskey doesn't know that Yorktown's dive bombers are attacking Soryu at the same moment, scoring 3 hits that leave a 3rd Japanese carrier burning. The coordinated attack that McCluskey planned for weeks happened accidentally, different air groups from different carriers arriving over the target at the same time, through coincidence rather than planning. The result is 3 Japanese carriers fatally damaged in 5 minutes, the most decisive 5 minutes in naval aviation history. But the battle isn't over. Hiryu, the 4th Japanese carrier, is 15 miles north of the other carriers and hasn't been touched. She's already launching a counter-attrike against the American carriers, and Enterprise's turn to defend is coming very soon. The return flight is desperate. McCluskey's fuel gauge shows 20 gallons remaining, barely enough for 20 minutes of flight. Other aircraft are in worse condition, some pilots radioing that they have 15 minutes of fuel left, maybe less. The radio is full of calls from pilots considering ditching near destroyers rather than trying to reach Enterprise. McCluskey maintains formation discipline, leading the group back toward where Enterprise should be, but he's navigating by dead reckoning and hoping his course calculations are correct. At 11:15, one SBD runs out of fuel and ditches, the pilot and radio man climbing out as the aircraft sinks. A destroyer changes course to pick them up. At 11:25, another SBD ditches. McCluskey's fuel gauge is below 10 gallons, the engine running on fumes, when he finally spots Enterprise on the horizon. The landing is controlled chaos. Aircraft are arriving with fuel gauges on empty. some engines quitting on the final approach. The landing signal officer waves aircraft aboard without the usual precision, knowing that every second counts. One SBD's engine quits as the pilot turns onto final approach, forcing a dead stick landing that catches the number 3 wire purely through skill and luck. McCluskey lands with 7 gallons of fuel remaining, barely enough for another 10 minutes of flight. His radio man, Cho Chalusek, is lifted out of the aircraft by deck crew because his legs won't support him after 4 hours in the cramped rear cockpit. The armament crew counts bullet holes in McCluskey's aircraft, finding 18 holes from Japanese anti-aircraft fire, none of them in critical areas. He's been shot at and hit and survived, which makes him luckier than 14 other Enterprise aircrew who didn't come back. By 1300 hours, the recovery is complete and the damage assessment begins. Enterprise launched 51 aircraft at 0702. 37 returned. 14 are missing, shot down or ditched due to fuel exhaustion, taking 40 air crew with them. It's a 27% loss rate, painful but acceptable given what they accomplished. The intelligence summaries confirm that 3 Japanese carriers are burning and likely to sink. But Hiryu is still operational, and radar reports indicate Japanese aircraft inbound. Enterprise has won the first round of the battle, but the second round is about to begin, and this time Enterprise will be the target instead of the attacker. Admiral Spruance receives the radar reports on the flag bridge and gives orders to launch the combat air patrol. The Battle of Midway is only half over, and the hardest part is yet to come. June 4th, 1942, 14:12 hours. Task Force 16, 150 miles northeast of burning Japanese carriers. The radar operator's voice crackles over the flag bridge speaker with mechanical precision. Bogies bearing 270, distance 40 miles, closing. Admiral Spruance checks his watch and does the mental calculation automatically. In 40 miles at 180 knots, closure speed means 13 minutes until the Japanese aircraft reach Enterprise. 13 minutes to scramble fighters, position the combat air patrol, prepare the anti-aircraft batteries, and maneuver the ship into defensive position. Around him, the flag bridge erupts into controlled activity as staff officers plot the incoming raid's course on the tactical display. The plot shows 18 Val dive bombers and 60 fighters from Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier, heading directly for Enterprise. Captain George Murray receives the warning on the navigation bridge and immediately orders general quarters. The alarm bells sound throughout the ship, a harsh clanging that sends 2,900 men racing to battle stations. Watertight doors slam shut, and dividing Enterprise into separate compartments that can be isolated if the ship takes damage. Gun crews sprint to their stations, loading 5-inch anti-aircraft guns and training them toward the bearing where the Japanese aircraft will appear. The 40mm Bofors guns and 20mm Oerlikon cannons that line Enterprise's catwalks receive ammunition from ready lockers, gunners checking their weapons and scanning the sky. Below decks, damage control parties take position with firefighting equipment and portable pumps, preparing for damage they hope won't come. Fighter Direction Officer Alexander Crowell sits at the radar display in the Combat Information Center, watching the incoming raid and the friendly fighters he's trying to vector into intercept position. Enterprise has 8 F-4F Wildcats airborne, all circling at 15,000 feet in loose combat air patrol. Crowell's job is to guide these fighters to the right altitude and bearing to intercept the Japanese before they reach attack position. But the radar can only tell him range and bearing, not altitude, and the fighter direction procedures are still primitive compared to what they'll become later in the war. Crowell makes his best guess based on experience, orders the fighters to descend to 12,000 feet and head southwest. The fighters acknowledge and turn toward the intercept, pilots scanning the horizon for bogies. At 14:17, Fighting Squadron 6 engages the incoming Japanese aircraft 30 miles from Enterprise. The radio traffic becomes a confused shouting match as pilots call out targets and report kills. Once Lieutenant Albert Vorse shoots down one Val dive bomber with a deflection shot that rakes the enemy aircraft from nose to tail. Ensign Edgar Bassett destroys a Zero in a head-on pass that requires nerve and accuracy in equal measure. But most of the Japanese aircraft penetrate through the fighter screen, either by diving through the interception or by using superior speed to outrun the Wildcats. By 1419, 16 Vals and 4 Zeros are still inbound, now 20 miles from Enterprise and closing fast. The Combat Air Patrol shot down 2 Vals and 2 Zeros, a modest success, but not enough to stop the attack. Enterprise's 5-inch anti-aircraft guns open fire at 1420, their shells bursting at preset altitudes to create patterns of shrapnel that fill the sky. The sound is overwhelming, all but continuous thunder that makes communication possible only through sound-powered phone circuits. Black puffs of smoke appear around the incoming Japanese aircraft as the 5-inch shells detonate, but the Vals maintain formation and continue their approach. Captain Murray watches from the bridge wing, judging the moment when he'll need to begin evasive maneuvers. Wait too long and the ship won't have time to turn before the dive bombers attack. Maneuver too early, and the Japanese pilots can adjust their dives to compensate. Murray has done this dozens of times in training exercises, but never with live bombs that can kill his ship. At 1421, the lead Val rolls into its dive, the pilot pushing the aircraft's nose down 70 degrees and heading straight for Enterprise's flight deck. Thal Murray shouts orders to the helmsman. Right full rudder, all engines ahead flank. Enterprise heels over into a maximum rate turn, her rudder hard over, propellers thrashing the water to white foam as she accelerates to 31 knots. The ship is 825 feet long and displaces 25,000 tons, mass and momentum that can't be changed instantly. But the turn begins to swing Enterprise's stern through the turning circle. The 40mm and 20mm guns on the starboard side open fire, tracers reaching up toward the diving Val like fingers trying to swat a fly. The Val continues its dive, seemingly immune to the anti-aircraft fire, growing larger and larger until individual details become visible. The fixed landing gear, the pilot hunched in the cockpit, the bomb visible under the fuselage. The bomb releases at 2,000 feet, a 250-kilogram weapon that drops in a ballistic arc toward Enterprise's flight deck. The Val pulls out of its dive and turns away, trailing smoke from hits by 20mm shells but still flying. The bomb continues downward, aimed at a point on the flight deck where Enterprise would have been if Murray hadn't turned. Instead, the bomb passes down the ship's starboard side, exploding in the water 50 feet from the hull. The underwater explosion sends a shockwave through Enterprise's hull, buckling steel plates and causing leaks in compartments near the waterline. 3 sailors in a lower compartment are killed instantly by the shockwave, their bodies found later with no visible external injuries but massive internal trauma. Enterprise has survived her first attack by Japanese carrier aircraft, but 17 more Vals are still diving. The next 3 minutes are chaos measured in seconds. Val after Val rolls into attack dives, releases bombs, and pulls away. Murray throws Enterprise into continuous evasive maneuvers, turning hard right then hard left, changing speed from flank to 2/3 and back to flank, creating an unpredictable track that forces the Japanese bombardiers to adjust their aim at the last second. The anti-aircraft guns fire continuously, the 5-inch guns pumping out shells so fast that the barrels glow red and ammunition handlers burn their hands on the hot casings. The 40mm guns walk tracers through the sky, catching one Val as it pulls out of its dive and sending it cartwheeling into the ocean. The 20mm guns fire in short bursts, their high rate of fire creating a steel curtain that no aircraft can safely penetrate. 2 more bombs explode close aboard, one off the port bow and one off the starboard quarter. Each explosion sends geysers of water skyward, drenching the gun crews and adding to the confusion. Shrapnel from the near misses tears through unarmored areas topside, killing 2 more sailors and wounding a dozen others. One piece of shrapnel cuts through a fire hose, spraying seawater across the flight deck. Another piece penetrates the ship's skin and lodges in a structural member, weakening the hull but not critically. Enterprise is being hammered by near misses that don't penetrate her armor, but accumulate damage through shock effects and fragmentation. Yet Murray knows that one direct hit could cripple the ship, but so far his ship handling has kept the bombs from connecting. 3 miles to the south, Yorktown is less fortunate. The same Japanese strike group split its attack between Enterprise and Yorktown. and Yorktown takes 3 direct bomb hits in rapid succession. Enterprise's crew watches their sister ship disappear behind columns of smoke and fire, not knowing whether Yorktown will survive. The sight focuses Enterprise's crew with terrifying clarity. This is what happens when the bombs connect, when your luck runs out, when the ship handling isn't quite good enough. Some men pray silently at their battle stations. Others focus on their jobs with mechanical intensity, finding comfort in routine tasks performed under impossible conditions. A few curse the Japanese pilots with creative profanity that helps channel their fear into anger. By 1425, the attack is over. The surviving Japanese aircraft turn northwest and head back toward Hiryu, leaving Enterprise still operational but shaken. The damage control parties report casualties and battle damage. 5 men killed, 8 wounded, numerous compartments flooded or damaged by near misses, but no critical hits. The ship can still make 30 knots, launch, and recover aircraft, fight if necessary. Captain Murray secures from General Quarters to Modified Condition 1, keeping major weapons manned, but allowing some crew members to rest. The relief is palpable, but temporary. Everyone knows Hiryu is still operational, and will likely launch another strike before the day ends. Admiral Spruance receives damage reports from all 3 carriers at 1445. Enterprise is operational, with minor damage. Hornet is undamaged, her fighters having intercepted most of the attack group before it reached her. Yorktown is badly hurt, but still afloat, capable of making 17 knots, but unable to conduct flight operations. Spruance makes the tactical decision that defines his command style. He orders Enterprise and Hornet to launch an immediate strike against Hiryu, rather than waiting to see if Yorktown can be saved. It's a cold calculation that prioritizes destroying the enemy's offensive capability over protecting a damage-friendly ship. Some officers later criticize the decision as heartless. Spruance accepts the criticism, but maintains he was right. Midway will be won by whichever side destroys the other's carriers first, and sentiment has no place in that equation. Enterprise begins spotting aircraft for the strike at 1500 hours. The ordnance crews load 1,000-pound bombs onto 24 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, working with practiced efficiency despite exhaustion from 12 hours at battle stations. Pilots who attacked Japanese carriers this morning will fly again this afternoon, giving them 2 strikes in one day against targets separated by 170 miles. It's unprecedented, pushing both aircraft and crews beyond designed limits, but it's necessary. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, who led Scouting Squadron 6 this morning, will lead the combined strike this afternoon. He briefs his pilots quickly, shows them the estimated position of Hiryu on a chart, always reminds them that fuel will be critical on the return flight. Some pilots who barely made it back this morning wonder if they'll make it back this time. Nobody voices the concern aloud. The launch goes smoothly at 15:30, 24 dive bombers and 8 fighters heading northwest toward Hiryu's last known position. Enterprise settles into a waiting pattern, maintaining course and speed, recovering aircraft that need fuel or repairs, preparing to defend against another Japanese strike if Hiryu can launch, before Enterprise's attack arrives. Below decks, the damage control parties work on repairs, welding steel plates over cracked hull plating, pumping out flooded compartments, restoring systems damaged by near misses. Aviation machinist's mate Bruno Guido helps repair an SBD that has hydraulic damage from shrapnel. He's been at his battle station for 12 hours, worked on dozens of damaged aircraft, and the day is far from over. But Guido is discovering something about himself. He's good under pressure, better than he thought he'd be, and he takes pride in keeping aircraft flying, despite the chaos around him. In 4 hours, when Enterprise recovers the strike group that attacked Hiryu, Guido will learn that his work contributed to sinking 4 Japanese carriers in one day, the most decisive naval victory in American history. But, right now, he's just a mechanic doing his job, one aircraft at a time, helping Enterprise survive a battle that could still go either way. June 7th, 1942. 300 miles northeast of Midway Island. The burial detail assembles on Enterprise's fantail at 0800 hours. 38 canvas-wrapped bodies laid in rows on the deck. Each canvas shroud contains a dead sailor or aviator killed during the Battle of Midway. their bodies recovered from damaged aircraft or found in compartments flooded during the near-miss attacks. Captain George Murray stands with the chaplain, reading names from a list, while the crew stands at attention. Ensign John Bridges, killed when his dive bomber was shot down attacking Kwajalein. Aviation machinist mate, second class Harold Jones, killed by shockwave from a near-miss bomb. Radio man, third class. Robert Patterson, shot down by Japanese fighters during the morning strike. The names continue. 38 men who left Pearl Harbor 9 days ago and won't return. The ceremony is brief because Enterprise remains at battle stations. A patrolling the waters northeast of Midway, looking for remnants of the Japanese fleet. Each shroud slides into the ocean after the chaplain completes the committal, hitting the water with a splash that's somehow both insignificant and final. The bodies will sink 3,000 feet to the ocean floor, joining Yorktown, which sank yesterday morning after being torpedoed by a Japanese submarine, taking another 30 men with her. Enterprise's crew watches their shipmates disappear beneath the waves, processing the reality that they survived while others didn't. Some cry silently, tears mixing with spray from the bow wave. Others stand with faces blank, shock and exhaustion, preventing emotional response. A few feel guilty that they're alive, wondering what made them more deserving of survival than the men sliding into the Pacific. The tactical assessment briefs at 0900 hours paint a picture that's simultaneously triumphant and sobering. American forces sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers at Midway: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. The Japanese lost 248 carrier aircraft, the pilots and air crew who manned them, and the institutional knowledge that can't be replaced by building new ships and training new pilots. It's the most decisive naval victory in American history, shifting the strategic balance in the Pacific from Japanese offensive dominance to rough parity. But the victory came at a cost that Enterprise's crew understands viscerally. The Navy lost Yorktown, 78 aircraft, and over 300 men. Enterprise herself lost 14 aircraft and 40 aircrew at Midway, plus the 5 men killed by near-miss damage. The mathematics favor America, but the human cost is distributed across specific families and specific ships in ways that statistics can't capture. Wade McCluskey reports to the sickbay on June 8th, complaining of pain in his shoulder and arm. The flight surgeon examines him and discovers McCluskey flew the entire Midway battle with a fractured shoulder, injured during the dive bombing attack on Kaga when his aircraft pulled out at 6 Gs and something inside his shoulder separated. McCluskey didn't mention the injury during the battle, didn't ask for medical attention when he landed, just accepted the pain as part of the cost of doing his job. The doctor is horrified and orders McCluskey to limited duty, which McCluskey ignores. He continues flying training missions, preparing Enterprise's air group for the next battle, and working through pain that would hospitalize most people. It's the kind of leadership that defines Enterprise's culture: competence, dedication, and a willingness to accept personal suffering if it helps the ship complete her mission. Enterprise arrives at Pearl Harbor on June 13th to a hero's welcome that feels surreal after the brutality of Midway. Hundreds of sailors and civilians line the pier, cheering and waving as Enterprise moors. A Navy band plays patriotic music that seems disconnected from the reality of combat. Admiral Chester Nimitz comes aboard to personally congratulate the crew, shaking hands with officers and enlisted men, telling them they've changed the course of the war. The ceremony is nice, but the crew would prefer sleep. Most of Enterprise's company has been at battle stations or working continuous shifts for the past 2 weeks. Men are sleeping at their duty stations, grabbing 4-hour naps between watches, surviving on coffee and willpower. The welcome ceremony concludes, and the crew finally gets liberty, 12 hours ashore to decompress from 2 weeks of combat operations. The repair assessment reveals damage more extensive than initially reported. The 3 near-miss bombs at Midway caused underwater shock damage that cracked hull plates, damaged fire mains, weakened structural frames, and created hundreds of small problems that individually are manageable but collectively require significant repair work. Pearl Harbor Navy Yard estimates 3 weeks for proper repairs, time to replace damaged plates, re-weld structural members, test and repair all systems affected by shock damage, but 3 weeks is too long. Saratoga is still being repaired from torpedo damage sustained in January. Wasp is in the Atlantic, supporting Operation Torch in North Africa. Enterprise and Hornet are the only operational carriers in the Pacific, and the Navy needs both of them ready for combat immediately. The compromise is 10 days of emergency repairs combined with crew rest and air group replenishment. Enterprise enters dry dock on June 14th, surrounded by repair crews who work around the clock. They cut out damaged hull sections and weld in new steel. They replace firefighting equipment damaged during Midway. They upgrade the Combat Information Center with better radar displays and improve fighter direction equipment. They install additional 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft guns on every available mount point, turning Enterprise into a floating hedgehog of defensive firepower. The work is done well but quickly, prioritizing systems critical to combat operations while deferring less important maintenance for later. The Air Group receives replacement pilots and aircraft to make up for Midway losses. Air Group 10 arrives on June 20th, replacing Air Group 6, which is rotated stateside for rest and reconstitution. The new pilots are fresh from training commands, young officers with 300 hours of flight time and no combat experience. They are introduced to Enterprise's veteran air crew, the survivors of Midway who've already proven themselves in combat. The dynamic is uncomfortable for both groups. Next, the veterans know the new pilots haven't been tested and might fail when the shooting starts. The new pilots feel inadequate compared to men who've already fought in history's most important carrier battle. Lieutenant Eldon Wheelhoyt, a new pilot assigned to Scouting Squadron 10, writes in his diary that he feels like a fraud wearing the same uniform as the Midway veterans. The intelligence briefings on June 24th reshape everyone's understanding of the strategic situation. The Battle of Midway eliminated Japan's offensive carrier capability, but Japan still controls most of the Western Pacific. Japanese forces occupied the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and numerous Pacific islands. They're constructing a major airfield on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, which would give them bomber range to attack shipping lanes between America and Australia. Admiral Nimitz decides the Navy must seize Guadalcanal before the airfield becomes operational, cutting off Japanese expansion in the South Pacific. The operation is scheduled for early August, which gives Enterprise 6 weeks to prepare for her next campaign. The 6 weeks pass in intensive training that transforms Air Group 10 from a collection of individual squadrons into a coordinated strike force. Lieutenant Commander John Crommelin, the new Air Group commander, drills the pilots relentlessly on the tactical lessons from Midway. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers will attack simultaneously from different directions, overwhelming enemy defenses. Fighters will escort the strike group to the target, then engage enemy fighters, it giving the bombers clear runs. If the strike group becomes separated during the flight, squadron commanders will attack independently rather than waste fuel searching for each other. The training is repetitive and exhausting, but Crommelin knows that routine becomes automatic under stress, and combat stress makes thinking almost impossible. Enterprise departs Pearl Harbor on July the 15th for the South Pacific, beginning a deployment that will last 7 months and include some of the most intense combat operations of the Pacific War. The crew understands they're heading into a different kind of war than Midway. Midway was a single decisive battle between carrier forces. Guadalcanal will be a prolonged campaign where Enterprise must support ground forces ashore, defend against Japanese air and naval attacks, and maintain operations without the support infrastructure available at Pearl Harbor. Logistics become as important as tactics. Enterprise carries limited fuel and ammunition, and resupply ships are weeks away. Every sortie must be planned with resource conservation in mind, balancing the need to strike the enemy against the risk of exhausting supplies. The ship's new status as the most important capital ship in the Pacific Fleet creates pressure that affects everyone aboard. With Yorktown sunk, Saratoga under repair, and Wasp committed to the Atlantic, Enterprise is the only fully capable carrier in the Pacific. Losing Enterprise would cripple American offensive operations for months, possibly longer. The crew feels the weight of that responsibility. Captain Murray receives daily messages from Nimitz emphasizing Enterprise's importance, reminding him that the ship must survive, even if that means withdrawing from combat when damaged. It's unprecedented guidance that reflects how desperate the strategic situation remains despite the Midway victory. The crew takes pride in being indispensable, but the burden is heavy. Every decision carries consequences that extend beyond the ship to the entire Pacific campaign. On August 3rd, Enterprise crosses the equator, entering the South Pacific for the first time. The traditional crossing ceremony is abbreviated due to combat operations, but the crew maintains some elements of the ritual. King Neptune comes aboard, played by a chief petty officer wearing a makeshift crown and carrying a trident fashioned from a mop handle. The Polywogs, sailors who've never crossed the equator, each receive ceremonial dunking and mild hazing that provides brief respite from the tension of approaching combat. Aviation machinist's mate, Bruno Guido, now a Polywog becoming a shellback, submits to the ceremony with good humor. He's been aboard Enterprise for 20 months, participated in every combat operation since Pearl Harbor, and earned respect from officers and enlisted men alike. But he's still 22 years old, still finding his place aboard a ship that's becoming legendary. In 3 weeks, at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Guido will man a machine gun and shoot down a Japanese aircraft attacking Enterprise. He'll become the first enlisted man awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, though he won't live to see the end of the war. But today, he's just a mechanic crossing the equator, or grateful for a few hours of normal Navy ritual amid the abnormality of extended combat operations. August 7th, 1942. Task Force 16, 100 miles southeast of Guadalcanal. The pre-dawn darkness is broken only by running lights as Enterprise launches her first combat air patrol at 0500 hours. 18F 4F Wildcat. Fighters that will maintain defensive screen over the invasion fleet landing Marines on Guadalcanal. From Enterprise's flight deck, the crew can see nothing of the island, no indication that 8,000 Marines are climbing into landing craft and heading for beaches that might be heavily defended or completely unoccupied. Intelligence reports about Japanese strength on Guadalcanal range from 500 to 5,000 troops, which means the planners have no real idea what the Marines are facing. Enterprise's job is providing air cover for the landing force, protecting the transports and cargo ships from Japanese air attack while the Marines go ashore. The Guadalcanal invasion, Operation Watchtower, is America's first offensive ground operation of the Pacific War. It's also a strategic gamble that commits Enterprise to extended operations in the South Pacific without adequate support. Saratoga is en route from Pearl Harbor but won't arrive for another week. WASP is still in the Atlantic. Enterprise is the only carrier protecting an amphibious invasion 3,000 miles from Pearl Harbor, operating in waters that Japanese submarines and surface ships can reach from multiple bases. If Enterprise is sunk or disabled, the entire landing force becomes vulnerable to Japanese counterattack. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commands the overall operation from Saratoga, but Enterprise's protection of the invasion force rests squarely on her crew's shoulders. The first Japanese air attack arrives at 13:15, the 45 bombers from Rabaul, escorted by fighters, heading directly for the transport anchorage off Guadalcanal. Enterprise's combat air patrol intercepts them 60 miles from the fleet, F-4F Wildcats diving into the Japanese formation from above. The radio circuit fills with combat calls. Tally-ho, bandits 11 o'clock high. I'm on him, taking the shot. Break right, one on your tail. Lieutenant Albert Vorse from Fighting Squadron. 10 shoots down 2 Japanese bombers in a single pass. That using deflection shooting, he perfected during training to catch the bombers as they turn. Ensign James Caldwell destroys a Zero in a head-on pass that requires extraordinary nerve, the 2 aircraft closing at a combined 500 miles per hour with both pilots firing. The combat air patrol shoots down 11 Japanese aircraft before they reach the fleet, losing 2 Wildcats in the process. But 24 Japanese bombers penetrate through the fighter screen and attack the transport anchorage. Enterprise's crew watches from 100 miles away as columns of smoke rise from Guadalcanal, unable to help because her fighters are engaged elsewhere. The Japanese bombers sink 1 transport and damage 3 others, killing 43 sailors and setting back the landing schedule by hours. It's a reminder that one carrier can't be everywhere simultaneously. can't protect an entire invasion fleet spread across 50 square miles of ocean. Fletcher makes the controversial decision to withdraw the carriers that night, removing Enterprise from the immediate area before Japanese submarines can attack her. The Marines on Guadalcanal are left without carrier air support, forced to rely on their own aircraft operating from Henderson Field, the incomplete airstrip they're fighting to capture. August 24th brings the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the second major carrier engagement of the Pacific War. Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku are approaching from the north, intending to attack Henderson Field and support a Japanese ground offensive on Guadalcanal. Enterprise scouts locate the Japanese carriers at 0940, 180 miles north of Enterprise's position. The strike launch begins immediately. 38 SBD, Dauntless dive bombers, and 7 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers heading north, while Enterprise's combat air patrol maintains defensive positions overhead. The strike coordination is better than Midway, but still imperfect, with bombers and torpedo aircraft arriving over the target several minutes apart rather than simultaneously. The Japanese counterattack arrives while Enterprise's strike group is still outbound. Radar picks up bogies at 1412, bearing north, distance 70 miles, closing at 300 knots. It's a large raid, perhaps 60 aircraft, heading directly for Enterprise. Fighter Direction Officer Lieutenant Hamilton Dow vectors 8F, 4F, Wildcats toward the incoming raid, but 8 fighters against 60 attackers is mathematical desperation rather than realistic defense. The Wildcats engage 30 miles from Enterprise, shooting down several Japanese aircraft, but unable to stop the main body. The combat air patrol is outnumbered 7-1, and the Japanese have better aircraft and more experienced pilots. At 1614, the attack begins with Val dive bombers rolling into their attacks from 12,000 feet. Captain Murray throws Enterprise into maximum evasive maneuvers, turning hard and changing speed continuously to spoil the bombardier's aim. The 5-inch anti-aircraft guns fire so rapidly that the barrels overheat and need water cooling. The 40mm Bofors guns maintain a continuous wall of tracers, catching one Val as it pulls out of its dive and sending it cartwheeling into the ocean. The 20mm Oerlikon cannons fire in short bursts, gunners tracking targets manually because the guns lack powered mounts. The noise is deafening, a continuous roar that makes thought almost impossible. The first bomb hits Enterprise at 1616, penetrating the flight deck just forward of the aft elevator. The bomb explodes on the second deck, tearing a 15-foot hole in the flight deck and starting fires in the gallery deck below. Fragments from the explosion kill 7 men instantly and wound 30 more. The fires spread rapidly through compartments containing paint and flammable materials, creating dense smoke that fills passageways and makes navigation nearly impossible. Damage control parties respond immediately. A's wearing oxygen-breathing apparatus and carrying fire hoses into smoke so thick they can't see their hands in front of their faces. They fight the fire by touch and training, advancing hoses toward the sound of flames and feeling for heat through their protective clothing. The second bomb hits at 1617, striking near the island structure on the starboard side. The explosion destroys the starboard 5-inch gun mount, killing the entire gun crew of 12 men, and damages the island structure enough to knock out several fire control systems. Shrapnel peppers the flight deck, killing or wounding men who were sheltering behind equipment they thought would protect them. One fragment tears through the bridge windows, narrowly missing Captain Murray and embedding itself in the chart table. Murray continues conning the ship despite the damage, ordering turns and speed changes that keep the ship maneuvering unpredictably. The third bomb hits at 1619, penetrating the flight deck aft and exploding in the crew berthing area. The blast kills 35 men who were taking shelter in compartments they believed were safe from topside attacks. The explosion also ruptures the aviation fuel system, allowing fuel vapor to escape into adjacent compartments. Damage Control Central receives reports of fuel vapor, and every man in the Damage Control Organization remembers what happened to Lexington at Coral Sea. Fuel vapor explosions that couldn't be controlled, leading to progressive fires that consume the ship. Enterprise is facing the same danger, and the next few minutes will determine whether she survives or joins Lexington on the bottom. Lieutenant Herschel Smith, Damage Control Officer, leads a repair party into the forward compartments where fuel vapor is accumulating. He's wearing an oxygen-breathing apparatus that gives him 30 minutes of air, working in darkness because the lighting system is destroyed, feeling his way through passageways by touch. His team locates the ruptured fuel line and isolates it using manual shut-off valves, stopping the vapor leak. Then they begin ventilating the contaminated compartments, using portable fans to push the vapor-laden air overboard before it can ignite. It's painstaking work done under conditions where one spark could trigger an explosion, but Smith's team completes the job without casualties. Their work saves Enterprise from the fate that killed Lexington, though Smith won't receive recognition for it until months later when the damage control reports are reviewed by Navy analysts. By 1625, the Japanese attack is over. Enterprise has been hit 3 times, suffered 74 killed and 95 wounded, and sustained damage that would normally require months in a Navy yard to repair properly. The flight deck has 3 bomb holes, the largest 15 feet in diameter. The forward elevator is jammed in the raised position, preventing flight operations forward of the damage. The hangar deck is filled with smoke and fire. The ship is making 27 knots, but could be reduced to lower speed if additional damage occurs. She's wounded, but still operational. Still capable of recovering aircraft and defending herself, still fighting despite everything the Japanese threw at her. The recovery of the strike group begins at 1645, complicated by the damaged flight deck. The aft portion of the deck is still usable, so the landing signal officer positions himself aft and waves aircraft aboard onto the undamaged section. The pilots execute approaches that thread between the bomb holes, catching arresting wires that land them within feet of the damaged areas. One SBD misses all the wires and goes into the barricade, nose crumpling and propeller shattering, but the crew walks away, unhurt. Another SBD lands with its landing gear damaged by anti-aircraft fire, skidding across the deck in a shower of sparks before coming to rest against the island structure. The flight deck crew performs miracles of improvisation, pushing damaged aircraft over the side to clear the landing area, rigging emergency barriers, maintaining operations despite conditions that would shut down a normal carrier. Aviation machinist's maydays. Bruno Gaido has his moment of glory during the attack. When Japanese aircraft broke through the fighter screen, Gaido grabbed a machine gun from a damaged aircraft and manned it during the attack, firing at Japanese dive bombers as they pulled out of their runs. He shot down one Val dive bomber, the first enlisted man to achieve an aerial kill while serving aboard a carrier. Admiral Halsey, who's returned to Enterprise as task force commander after his hospitalization, personally awards Gaido the Distinguished Flying Cross and promotes him to Aviation Machinist's Mate First Class. Now, it's the kind of recognition that makes careers in the peacetime Navy, but in wartime it's just another moment in a continuous string of emergencies that defines life aboard Enterprise during the Guadalcanal campaign. By evening, damage control parties have brought the fires under control and begun emergency repairs. Welders fabricate steel plates to cover the bomb holes in the flight deck, working through the night to restore flight operations capability. Electricians splice cut cables and restore power to damaged sections. Carpenters shore up weakened bulkheads and decks. The work is brutal and dangerous, done in confined spaces filled with smoke and fuel fumes. But the crew maintains the pace because they know Enterprise must remain operational. There are no other carriers available to relieve her, but Saratoga won't arrive for 3 more days. If Enterprise withdraws for repairs, the entire Guadalcanal operation loses its air cover and might fail. The crew works through exhaustion and pain because the alternative is unacceptable. Admiral Fletcher reports to Nimitz that night, Enterprise damaged but operational. Estimate 74 killed, 95 wounded. Flight operations possible using aft deck. Proceeding to Noumea for emergency repairs. The message is characteristically terse, revealing nothing about how close Enterprise came to following Lexington into the deep. Nimitz responds with equal brevity. Well done, Enterprise. Effect repairs and return to operations soonest. It's the kind of exchange that occurs between professionals who understand the situation without needing elaborate explanations. And Enterprise has been hurt, but not killed. She'll repair and return because that's what the mission requires. The Guadalcanal campaign is just beginning, and Enterprise will spend the next 3 months operating continuously in the South Pacific, fighting battles and avoiding destruction through a combination of skill, determination, and increasingly improbable luck. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons is over. The ordeal of Enterprise has only just begun. October 26, 1942, 09:17 hours. 200 miles northeast of the Santa Cruz Islands. The radar screen shows what everyone aboard Enterprise has been dreading: a massive formation of Japanese aircraft inbound from the north, range 80 miles and closing. Lieutenant Hamilton Dow, the fighter direction officer, counts the contacts and estimates 60 to 70 aircraft, the largest raid Enterprise has faced since the Eastern Solomons 2 months ago. Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commanding Task Force 16 from Enterprise's flag bridge, receives the report and knows immediately that this attack will be different. The Japanese have learned from their earlier failures. They're concentrating their entire strike from carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku against Enterprise and Hornet simultaneously, overwhelming the defenses through sheer numbers. 8F-4F, Wildcats on combat air patrol, cannot stop 70 attackers. Some will get through. Probably many will get through. And Enterprise is about to discover how much punishment a Yorktown-class carrier can absorb. The morning began with Enterprise launching her own strike at 0740. In 30 ESB-D Dauntless dive bombers and 8 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers heading north to attack the Japanese carriers. The strike coordination worked better than previous operations, with Enterprise and Hornet aircraft forming up properly and proceeding to the target as a unified force. But the launch took longer than planned, and by the time Enterprise's aircraft departed, the Japanese had already launched their counterstrike. Now it's a race. Which strike group will reach the enemy carriers first, and which carrier force will be more damaged when the attacks conclude. Captain Osborne Hardison, Enterprise's commanding officer since August, when George Murray rotated stateside, stands on the bridge wing calculating distances and closure rates. Trying to determine if Enterprise's strike will hit the Japanese carriers before or after the Japanese strike hits Enterprise. The mathematics suggests they'll be nearly simultaneous. The Combat Air Patrol engages the incoming raid at 0930 at 60 miles from Enterprise. The 8 Wildcats dive into a formation of 30 Val dive bombers, 20 Kate torpedo bombers, and 20 Zero fighters, absurdly outnumbered, but attacking anyway, because there's nothing else they can do. Lieutenant Stanley Vejtasa shoots down 3 Vals in less than 4 minutes. Remarkable marksmanship that depletes his ammunition before the main attack begins. Ensign Walter Henry destroys 2 Kates with deflection shots that require him to fire at aircraft 100 yards ahead of where they appear in his gun sight. The radio circuit becomes chaos. Splash 1, got him diving. 2 more at 9 o'clock level. I'm Winchester, returning to base. Winchester means out of ammunition. Returning to base means heading back to Enterprise to rearm. And Enterprise won't have time to land and rearm fighters before the Japanese arrive. The Combat Air Patrol shoots down 7 Japanese aircraft, but barely slows the attack. At 0945, Enterprise's radar operators watch the remaining Japanese aircraft split into 2 groups. One group heads for Hornet, visible on the horizon 15 miles to the south. The second group, about 30 aircraft, continues directly toward Enterprise. Captain Hardison orders general quarters, unnecessary because the ship has been at battle stations since 0700, but the formal order focuses the crew's attention. This is it. This is the attack everyone knew was coming, eventually. The gun crews train their weapons north, scanning the sky for targets that will appear in about 5 minutes. Below decks, damage control parties take positions with firefighting equipment and portable pumps. In the engine rooms, the crew maintains full power output, knowing the ship will need every knot of speed for the evasive maneuvers that might make the difference between survival and death. The Japanese attack begins at 0950 with dive bombers pushing over from 12,000 feet. Hardison throws Enterprise into a hard right turn, maximum rudder deflection that heels the ship over enough to make men grab for handholds. The 5-inch guns open fire, their shells creating black puffs at preset altitudes. But the Japanese pilots dive through the flak without hesitation. They're veterans, men who've been flying combat since 1937, who attacked Pearl Harbor and Darwin and Colombo, who know exactly how to attack carriers. They roll into 70-degree dives and track the turning carrier with practiced precision, adjusting their aim points to compensate for Enterprise's evasive maneuvers. The first bomb releases at 3,000 feet, and everyone on Enterprise's bridge can see it coming, a black object that grows larger and larger until individual stabilizing fins become visible. The bomb hits at 0952, striking the flight deck just forward of the aft elevator. It penetrates the wooden flight deck planking and the steel deck beneath, explodes on the third deck in a crew berthing compartment, and the blast kills 35 men instantly. The explosion tears a 12-foot hole in the flight deck and starts fires in multiple compartments. Fragments from the bomb puncture the aviation fuel system, and fuel begins leaking into spaces below the hangar deck, the same scenario that killed Lexington 5 months ago. Damage Control Central receives the fuel leak report and immediately dispatches repair parties wearing breathing apparatus. They have minutes to isolate the leak before fuel vapor accumulates to dangerous levels. The second bomb hits at 0954, striking near the island structure on the starboard side. The explosion destroys the starboard side 5-inch gun gallery, killing the entire gun crew of 14 men, and damages fire control systems that coordinate the anti-aircraft batteries. A shrapnel tears through the island structure, wrecking radio equipment and killing 3 men in the air operations office. One fragment passes through the bridge, missing Captain Hardison by less than 3 feet, and embeds itself in the compass repeater. Hardison continues conning the ship despite the near miss, shouting orders to the helmsman, whose hands are shaking so badly he can barely hold the wheel. The helmsman is 19 years old, has been in the Navy for 8 months, and he's trying to maintain professional composure while his ship is being blown apart around him. The third bomb hits at 0958, penetrating the flight deck aft and exploding in the hangar deck. The blast destroys 3 SBD Dauntless dive bombers parked on the hangar deck, their fuel tanks exploding and adding to the fires. Yet the hangar deck becomes an inferno, flames spreading along the overhead where aviation fuel has splashed, temperatures reaching levels that melt aluminum and ignite paint. The hangar deck firefighting system activates automatically, spraying seawater through overhead nozzles. But the fires are too intense and spread too quickly for the automatic system to control. Damage control parties enter the hangar deck, wearing oxygen masks and carrying fog nozzles, the only firefighting equipment effective against petroleum fires. They advance into the flames, spraying fog patterns that cool the fire and displace oxygen, slowly gaining control through tactics developed at Damage Control School and practiced endlessly during drills. At 10:05, a fourth explosion rocks Enterprise, but this one isn't from a bomb. The forward 5-inch magazine has been reached by fire, and 44 men die instantly when the magazine explodes. The blast is catastrophic, tearing a massive hole in the ship's side below the waterline and sending fragments through multiple decks. For several minutes, Damage Control Central loses contact with forward compartments, and nobody knows if the explosion will trigger a chain reaction that detonates other magazines. Lieutenant Herschel Smith, Damage Control Officer, leads a party forward to assess the damage. They find flooding in 4 compartments, fires in 6 more, and structural damage so severe that bulkheads designed to be watertight are buckled and leaking. Smith orders emergency shoring, using wooden timbers to brace the weakened bulkheads, and directs pumping operations to control the flooding. It's desperate improvisation done in darkness and smoke, but somehow it works. By 10:15, the Japanese attack is over, the surviving aircraft turning north to return to their carriers. Enterprise is hurt worse than she's ever been hurt. Damage that dwarfs the Eastern Solomons hits by an order of magnitude. 74 men are dead, another 95 wounded, some critically. The flight deck has 3 major holes and dozens of smaller punctures. The forward elevator is destroyed, blown completely off its guides by the magazine explosion. The hangar deck is filled with smoke and burning aircraft. The ship is making 23 knots, reduced from her normal 32, because the engineering plant has lost efficiency due to shock damage. She's listing 3 degrees to starboard from flooding. And the list is slowly increasing as water finds new paths through damaged compartments. Captain Hardison faces the decision that every carrier captain dreads. Does Enterprise have enough damage control capability remaining to save the ship? Or should he prepare to abandon ship before progressive flooding capsizes her? He consults with the damage control officer and the engineering officer, both of whom believe the ship can be saved if the flooding can be controlled and the fires extinguished. Hardison makes the call. Enterprise will fight to survive. He passes word throughout the ship. All hands not engaged in damage control or gunnery duties, prepare to jettison topside weight. It's standard procedure for a ship that's listing and in danger of capsizing. Reduce topside weight by throwing everything possible overboard, improving stability and reducing the risk of capsize. The crew responds with disciplined urgency. Aircraft that are too damaged to fly, again, are pushed over the side, millions of dollars of equipment disappearing into the Pacific without hesitation. Spare parts, ammunition crates, anything not immediately necessary goes overboard. Gun crews muscle damaged 5-inch gun mounts over the side, 5-ton pieces of steel that disappear with satisfying splashes. The list stabilizes at 4 degrees, then begins slowly decreasing as the counter-flooding and pumping operations take effect. By 1100 hours, the list is down to 2 degrees and continuing to improve. Enterprise isn't going to capsize. Whether she'll survive the day remains uncertain, but at least she won't roll over and sink in the next few hours. The recovery of Enterprise's strike group begins at 11:30. Complicated by the damaged flight deck and the fact that Hornet has been hit even harder than Enterprise. Hornet took 4 bombs, 2 torpedoes, and a kamikaze hit, the first deliberate suicide crash of the Pacific War, and she's dead in the water with fires burning out of control. Enterprise must recover not only her own aircraft, but also Hornet's, because there's nowhere else for them to go. The landing signal officer positions himself at the aft end of the flight deck, the only section still usable, and begins waving aircraft aboard. The pilots execute landings that require extraordinary skill, threading their aircraft between bomb holes and catching arresting wires with precision that leaves no margin for error. One SBD lands with battle damage that causes the tailhook to fail. The aircraft misses all the arresting wires and crashes into the barricade, the wooden barrier stretched across the deck to stop aircraft that miss the wires. The impact crushes the propeller and engine cowling, but the crew survives. The flight deck crew swarms over the wreck, cutting it apart with axes and pushing the pieces over the side to clear the landing area. Another SBD lands so short that the tailhook catches the number 1 wire, the wire closest to the ship's stern, with the aircraft's wheels barely touching the deck. The pilot adds power reflexively, thinking he's missed the deck entirely, and the aircraft lurches forward before the arresting gear absorbs the energy. The landing signal officer wonders how many more miracles the flight deck crew can produce before luck runs out. By 1300 hours, Enterprise has recovered 57 aircraft from both carriers, and the immediate crisis is over. The ship is stable, the fires are under control, and the flooding has been arrested. But Enterprise is in no condition to fight another battle. Admiral Kincaid orders the task force to withdraw south toward Noumea, where USS Vestal, the repair ship, waits with equipment and personnel to conduct emergency repairs. The withdrawal is conducted under continuous alert for Japanese submarines, which are known to operate in these waters and would love nothing better than to torpedo a damaged carrier limping away from battle. Enterprise maintains a combat air patrol overhead, despite the damage. All fighters launching and recovering from the shortened flight deck, proving that the ship remains operational, even if barely so. Hornet doesn't make it. By 1500 hours, her crew abandons ship, transferring to destroyers that come alongside. The destroyers try to sink Hornet with torpedoes and gunfire, but the tough Yorktown-class construction resists their best efforts. Finally, with Japanese surface ships approaching, the destroyers leave Hornet burning and sinking slowly. She'll remain afloat until the next morning, when Japanese destroyers finish her with torpedoes. Enterprise is now the only operational American carrier in the Pacific. Saratoga has been torpedoed again and is under repair. Wasp was sunk by submarine attack in September. Enterprise stands alone, damaged but functional, carrying the burden of American carrier aviation through the darkest period of the Guadalcanal campaign. The tactical assessment that evening reveals a battle that was nominally a Japanese victory, but strategically an American success. Enterprise and Hornet damaged the Japanese carrier Shokaku badly enough that she'll be under repair for 9 months. Enterprise sank one Japanese destroyer and damaged several other ships. But Hornet is lost, taking 64 aircraft with her. And Enterprise is so badly damaged that she can't conduct full flight operations. The loss rate for aircraft is 39%, unsustainable over a prolonged campaign. The casualty numbers are horrifying. 138 Americans killed on Enterprise and Hornet combined, 206 wounded. It's the bloodiest day for American carriers since Pearl Harbor. But beneath the grim statistics lies a reality that the Japanese understand better than the Americans. Japan can't replace the pilots lost at Santa Cruz. The Japanese lost 99 aircraft and 99 aircrew, most of them veterans with years of combat experience. They shot down American aircraft at favorable ratios, but the Americans have training programs that produce hundreds of new pilots every month. Japan's training programs are producing dozens. Every battle grinds down Japanese pilot quality, while American pilot quality improves. Santa Cruz was a tactical Japanese victory that brought them closer to strategic defeat, though nobody aboard Enterprise has the perspective to see that on October 26th. Aviation machinist mate Bruno Guido works in the hangar deck that evening, helping repair SBDs that survived the battle. The hangar deck still smells of smoke and firefighting foam, and there are bloodstains on the deck where wounded men were treated before being transferred to the sickbay. Guido has been aboard Enterprise for 2 years, participated in every major battle of the Pacific War, earned promotion to first class, and received the Distinguished Flying Cross. He's 23 years old, and he's exhausted in ways that sleep can't cure. He's seen too many friends die, patched too many aircraft that later got shot down, and he's beginning to wonder if Enterprise's luck will eventually run out. In 5 months, Guido will be shot down during a raid on Rabaul, captured by the Japanese, and executed. But tonight, he's just a mechanic doing his job, keeping aircraft flying despite impossible conditions, helping Enterprise survive another day. The Battle of Santa Cruz is over. Enterprise has survived, but barely, and the price of survival keeps increasing with every battle. October 27th, 1942, Noumea Harbor, New Caledonia. Enterprise limps into Noumea at 0800 hours, trailing oil from ruptured fuel tanks and listing 2 degrees to starboard despite the counter-flooding that stabilized her yesterday. The crew lines the rails, staring at the harbor that will be their home for the next 2 weeks, while repair crews work miracles with inadequate equipment and improvised materials. USS Vestal, the repair ship that saved Nevada at Pearl Harbor, her ship, sits at anchor surrounded by smaller craft that will ferry repair personnel and equipment to Enterprise. Vestal's commanding officer, Commander Thomas Wolverton, has been reviewing the damage reports radioed ahead by Enterprise, and he's quietly horrified by what he reads. The repair manual says Enterprise needs 3 to 4 months in a proper Navy yard to fix this level of damage. Wolverton has 2 weeks and whatever materials he can scavenge from other damaged ships in the harbor. The damage assessment begins as soon as Vestal moors alongside Enterprise. Wolverton's inspection teams swarm over the carrier, documenting every hit, every crack, every system damage by shock or blast effects. The forward elevator is completely destroyed, blown off its guides by the magazine explosion. The flight deck has 3 major holes and 37 smaller perforations from bomb fragments. The hangar deck's overhead is buckled from fires that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. Hull plating below the waterline has multiple cracks from shock damage, and several frames are bent or broken. The aviation fuel system has 17 separate leaks, any one of which could have caused an explosion like the one that killed Lexington. The electrical system has hundreds of severed cables that must be spliced or replaced. The damage list fills 43 pages of typed notes. Wolverton calls a conference with his senior repair officers on October 28th, laying out the scope of work with brutal honesty. They need to make Enterprise combat capable in 15 days, which means they can't repair everything properly. They'll patch rather than replace, shore up rather than rebuild, accept good enough rather than perfect. The forward elevator is beyond their capability to repair, so they'll weld a steel plate over the hole, and Enterprise will operate with 2 elevators instead of 3. The flight deck holes will be covered with steel plates scavenged from Japanese freighters wrecked in the harbor, plates that don't match Enterprise's specifications, but are strong enough to handle aircraft weight. The hull cracks will be welded from the inside, accessible only through manholes barely large enough for a welder to squeeze through with his equipment. It's industrial improvisation on a scale that would horrify Navy inspectors in peacetime. But peacetime standards don't apply when Enterprise is the only operational carrier in the Pacific. The work begins immediately, operating around the clock in 3 8-hour shifts. Vestal's crew works alongside Enterprise's crew, augmented by CB construction battalions that happen to be in Noumea, preparing for base construction projects. The CBs bring welding equipment, cutting torches, and an aggressive can-do attitude that meshes perfectly with Vestal's experienced repair specialists. They cut steel plates from the wrecked Japanese freighter Kinryu Maru, still resting on the bottom of Noumea Harbor after being sunk by American aircraft in August. The plates are cut underwater by Navy divers using pneumatic saws, lifted to the surface, shaped to fit Enterprise's damaged areas, then welded in place by crews working in shifts that blur into continuous operations. The welding work is brutally demanding. The temperatures in Noumea reach 90 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, and inside Enterprise's hull compartments, the temperature exceeds 120 degrees. Welders work in these conditions wearing heavy protective gear, breathing air contaminated by welding fumes and diesel exhaust from portable generators. They weld overhead, sparks falling onto their heads and shoulders, creating burns that they treat with ointment and ignore. They weld in confined spaces where 2 men can barely fit, passing welding rods and tools back and forth in choreographed movements developed through necessity. Several welders collapse from heat exhaustion and are carried topside to recover before returning to work. Nobody complains. Everyone understands that Enterprise must return to combat, and complaints won't fix the ship faster. The electrical repairs require different skills, but equal dedication. Enterprise's electrical system has over 100 miles of wiring running through the ship, connecting systems that range from radar to lighting to damage control communications. The bomb blasts and fires damage thousands of feet of this wiring, cutting cables and melting insulation. The repair electricians trace each damaged circuit, splicing breaks with waterproof connections and replacing entire cable runs when splicing isn't feasible. They scavenge wire from less critical systems, rob parts from damaged equipment to repair more important equipment, and fabricate connectors when standard parts aren't available. Chief Electrician's mate Raymond Moore supervises the work with obsessive attention to detail. That's testing every repair personally because a single bad connection could cause a fire or system failure during combat. The aviation fuel system repairs are the most dangerous work undertaken during the Noumea period. The system has 17 leaks in pipes that normally carry high-octane aviation gasoline under pressure. The welders must work on pipes that have contained gasoline recently, pipes where residual fuel vapor creates explosion risk. The procedure requires purging each section with inert gas before cutting or welding, testing for explosive vapors with portable detectors, and maintaining continuous ventilation during the work. Despite these precautions, there are 2 flash fires during the repair period, brief eruptions of flame that burn 3 workers and reinforce everyone's awareness that they're working on equipment designed to explode under the right conditions. Lieutenant Herschel Smith, the damage control officer, personally supervises the fuel system repairs, refusing to ask his men to take risks he won't take himself. By November 5th, 8 days into the repair period, Enterprise begins to look like a functional warship again. The flight deck is patched, though the repair plates are different colors and thicknesses than the original deck, giving Enterprise a quilted appearance that her crew finds oddly endearing. The hangar deck has been cleared of damaged aircraft and wreckage, the overhead painted to cover smoke damage. The hull cracks are welded, and the ship's list has been eliminated through careful ballasting. The engineering plant has been tested and achieves 27 knots, below the design 32 knots, but adequate for combat operations. The forward elevator remains inoperable, covered by a steel plate that's painted with a large 6 to remind pilots that this elevator isn't functional. Enterprise will operate with reduced aircraft capacity until the elevator can be properly repaired, whenever that might be. The crew uses the Noumea period to recover from 2 months of continuous combat operations. Men who've been at battle stations for days at a time finally get liberty ashore, though Noumea offers little in the way of entertainment. It's a French colonial town with a few bars, some restaurants, and not much else. But it's solid ground that doesn't move, and that's enough. Groups of sailors wander through town, drinking warm beer and eating food that isn't prepared in bulk aboard ship. They write letters home, describing their experiences in vague terms that pass the censors but convey nothing of combat's reality. Some visit the Red Cross facilities where volunteer workers provide coffee and conversation. A few attend church services, finding comfort in rituals that connect them to the lives they left behind when they joined Enterprise's crew. The Air Group receives replacement aircraft and pilots during the Noumea period. Air Group 10 has been ground down by 2 months of combat and operational accidents. The squadron strength is 45 aircraft, half the designed 90, and many of the remaining aircraft are damaged or worn out. 30 new aircraft arrive via cargo ship, SBDs and TBFs, crated and requiring assembly. May the Air Group maintenance crews uncrate the aircraft, install engines, test systems, and prepare them for combat operations. It's skilled work that requires precision, and the crews take pride in delivering aircraft that meet specifications despite working under field conditions. 20 new pilots arrived to replace casualties, and pilots rotated stateside due to fatigue. The new pilots are fresh from training commands, and the veterans look at them with mixture of sympathy and skepticism. Some of the new pilots will prove themselves in combat. Others won't survive their first mission. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, the new Air Group 10 commander, uses the Noumea period to drill the Air Group on tactical coordination. Flatley is a Naval Academy graduate who commanded a fighter squadron during the Coral Sea battle. And he's determined that Air Group 10 will execute coordinated strikes properly. He conducts classroom briefings on carrier attack tactics, showing pilots how to time their attacks so dive bombers and torpedo bombers arrive over the target simultaneously. He drills squadron commanders on navigation and communication procedures. He practices emergency procedures for damage situations and aircraft casualties. The training is intensive and sometimes contentious, with veteran pilots resisting instruction from a new commander who wasn't at Midway or Santa Cruz. But Flatley persists, and gradually the Air Group coalesces into an effective strike force. Admiral William Halsey visits Enterprise on November 10th, coming aboard via motor launch from his headquarters ashore. Halsey commanded Enterprise early in the war. He led her through the Marshall Islands raid and the Doolittle mission, and he considers her crew to be his crew, even though he's now Commander South Pacific Area, responsible for all operations in the Solomons. He walks through the ship, visiting damage control stations and repair sites, shaking hands with sailors and asking about their work. He stops in the hangar deck to examine the repaired bomb damage, running his hand over the welded plates and nodding with approval. In the wardroom, he briefs the officers on the strategic situation. Guadalcanal hangs in the balance. The Marines ashore are barely holding Henderson Field against repeated Japanese attacks, and the Navy must maintain control of the waters around Guadalcanal, or the Marines will be cut off and destroyed. And Halsey's message to Enterprise's crew is characteristically direct. The Pacific Fleet needs this ship. The Marines on Guadalcanal need this ship. I need this ship ready for combat in 4 days. The deadline is November 14th, when intelligence suggests the Japanese will make their major effort to retake Henderson Field. Large Japanese convoys are assembling at Rabaul and Truk, preparing to bring reinforcements down the slot to Guadalcanal. The Navy must stop these convoys, which means Enterprise must return to combat whether fully repaired or not. The crew receives the deadline with mixed feelings. Pride that they're needed, anxiety about going back into combat in a ship held together by improvised repairs, resignation that there's no real choice. Enterprise is the only carrier available, so Enterprise will fight regardless of readiness state. The final test comes on November 13th, when Enterprise conducts flight operations to verify that the repairs are adequate. The ship sortie from Noumea at 0800 hours, accelerating to 27 knots and turning into the wind. The first launch is 12 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, each aircraft carrying a 1,000-pound bomb to simulate combat loading. The catapult fires, the first SBD staggers into the air, and the crew holds its collective breath, waiting to see if the repaired flight deck can handle the stress. The SBD climbs away normally. The second launch goes equally well. By 0100 hours, 12 aircraft have launched without problems. The recovery begins at 1100 hours, like aircraft landing and catching arresting wires that bring them to controlled stops on the shortened deck. The landing signal officer reports that the deck appears structurally sound, though the repairs create some visual confusion for pilots who are used to seeing a uniform deck surface. By November 14th, Enterprise is back at sea, heading north toward Guadalcanal for what will become the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The ship is far from fully repaired, but she's combat capable, which is all that matters. The crew has worked around the clock for 15 days to achieve this result, an accomplishment that will be studied by damage control schools for decades. They took a carrier that should have been in a Navy yard for 4 months and made her operational in 2 weeks using scavenged materials and improvised techniques. It's industrial improvisation at its finest, and it saves the Guadalcanal campaign. If Enterprise hadn't been available for the November battles, the Japanese would have reinforced Guadalcanal successfully and probably retaken Henderson Field. The Marines would have been forced to evacuate, handing the Japanese a strategic victory that could have prolonged the Pacific War by years. Aviation machinist's mate, Bruno Guido, watches Noumea disappear over the horizon astern, knowing that he's heading back into combat aboard a ship that's one hit away from sinking. The repairs are good, but they're not perfect, and everyone aboard knows it. The forward elevator is welded shut. The hull has cracks that are welded but not reinforced. The fuel system has repairs that might fail under combat damage. But Guido also knows that Enterprise has survived 3 major battles and dozens of smaller actions. The ship seems to have a protective spirit that keeps her alive through circumstances that killed other carriers. The crew calls her the Big E with affection and respect, recognizing that they serve aboard something special. Whether that specialness is enough to survive what's coming remains to be seen. But on November 14th, 1942, Enterprise is heading back to war, ready or not, because there's nobody else to do the job. December 3rd, 1942. Task Force 16, 100 miles north of Guadalcanal. The dawn launch begins at 0530, 12 SBD, Dauntless dive bombers, climbing into darkness to conduct anti-submarine patrol around Task Force 16's perimeter. It's the same routine Enterprise has followed for 37 consecutive days, launching patrols before sunrise, maintaining combat air patrol throughout daylight hours, recovering aircraft at dusk, then starting again the next morning. The crew is exhausted beyond anything experienced during earlier operations. The Guadalcanal campaign has become a grinding war of attrition, where dramatic carrier battles have given way to monotonous daily operations, punctuated by sudden emergencies. There are no days off, no port visits, no relief. Enterprise is the only operational American carrier in the Pacific, so Enterprise stays at sea and keeps flying. The operational tempo is unsustainable, but continues anyway because there's no alternative. Air Group 10 flies 4 to 6 missions daily, attacking Japanese positions on Guadalcanal, escorting supply convoys, conducting reconnaissance over vast stretches of ocean where Japanese surface ships might be hiding. The pilots are flying 200 hours per month, double the peacetime maximum considered safe for carrier operations. Fatigue accumulates until pilots are falling asleep during briefings, nodding off in their cockpits while waiting to launch. The squadron commanders try to rotate pilots to give everyone rest, but there aren't enough pilots to allow proper rotation. The veterans fly because they have experience. The new pilots fly because the veterans need breaks. Everyone flies more than they should, and the accident rate climbs steadily. On December 7th, the first anniversary of Pearl Harbor, Enterprise is refueling from oiler USS Guadalupe 300 miles south of Guadalcanal. The refueling operation takes 8 hours, Enterprise maintaining course and speed alongside the oiler, while fuel hoses stretch between the ships and pump aviation gasoline and diesel fuel to replenish Enterprise's tanks. It's routine work made dangerous by Japanese submarines that hunt for exactly this kind of target. 2 ships locked together, moving at slow speed, unable to maneuver defensively. The destroyer screen maintains continuous active sonar searches, dropping depth charges on any suspicious contact. The combat air patrol orbits overhead, searching for periscopes. Everyone maintains heightened alert, knowing that one torpedo could cripple or sink either ship. The memory of Pearl Harbor hangs heavy over the crew. 1 year ago, Enterprise was racing back to Pearl Harbor, while Japanese aircraft destroyed the battleship fleet. It's 1 year ago, the war was brand new, and the crew was untested. Now, a year later, Enterprise is the most experienced carrier in the Pacific Fleet, her crew veterans of 6 major battles and dozens of smaller actions. But the victory everyone hoped would come quickly remains distant. Japan still controls most of the Western Pacific. Guadalcanal remains contested, with Marines barely holding Henderson Field against repeated Japanese attacks. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1942 will clearly extend into 1943 and possibly beyond. The crew marks the anniversary quietly, knowing that celebration would be inappropriate when so many ships remain unrevenged. The close call comes on January 30th, 1943. Enterprise's Combat Air Patrol spots a Japanese submarine on the surface, an I-1, charging batteries 60 miles northeast of the task force. The fighters strafe the submarine, forcing it to crash dive, then direct destroyers to the location. USS Fanning and USS Case arrive and begin depth charge attacks, working systematically to kill the submarine before it can escape. The underwater battle lasts 6 hours, the destroyers making repeated attack runs, while Enterprise circles at maximum speed, staying clear of the submarine's torpedo range. At 1600 hours, I-1 surfaces with damage that prevents her from submerging again. The destroyers close in and sink her with gunfire, rescuing one Japanese sailor who survives the sinking. It's Enterprise's first confirmed submarine kill, a small victory in a campaign where victories have become rare and precious. By February 1st, 1943, as the strategic situation on Guadalcanal has finally shifted decisively in America's favor. The Marines and Army troops ashore have defeated the last major Japanese ground offensive. Japanese destroyers are evacuating their remaining troops from Guadalcanal at night, admitting defeat in the first major ground campaign of the Pacific War. Enterprise's crew receives the news with quiet satisfaction rather than jubilation. They've been supporting the Guadalcanal campaign for 6 months, flying thousands of sorties, losing dozens of aircraft and air crew, enduring conditions that would break less determined crews. The victory vindicates their sacrifices, proves that their efforts mattered, but it doesn't feel like victory when you're exhausted beyond words and know the war is far from over. The cumulative attrition in Air Group 10 becomes statistically horrifying by mid-February. The squadron strength is 37 aircraft, down from 90 when the air group embarked in July. Some losses are combat, aircraft shot down by Japanese fighters, or anti-aircraft fire. Many losses are operational accidents, landing accidents that destroy aircraft and injure or kill crew, mechanical failures that force ditchings, navigation errors that leave aircraft lost at sea when they run out of fuel. Of the original Air Group 10 pilots who embarked in July 1942, only 34% remain. The others have been killed, wounded, transferred stateside due to fatigue, or declared missing in action. The replacement pipeline brings new pilots aboard regularly, but they lack experience and take weeks to become effective combat aviators. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, the Air Group commander, writes in his personal diary on February 15th, "The men are used up. They fly because they must, but the spark is gone. We're grinding them down to nothing, and soon there will be nothing left to grind." Flatley's assessment is brutal but accurate. The pilots show signs of combat fatigue that flight surgeons recognize as dangerous. They're making mistakes during missions, forgetting procedures they have executed hundreds of times. They're irritable and withdrawn, picking fights over minor issues. They're having nightmares that wake them screaming, seeing Japanese aircraft in every cloud formation. Some are drinking heavily, using alcohol to numb the fear and exhaustion. The flight surgeons recommend grounding several pilots for psychiatric evaluation, but there aren't enough replacements, so the pilots keep flying. The physical toll on Enterprise herself is equally concerning. The ship has been at sea for 142 consecutive days, the longest combat deployment of any carrier in the Pacific War. The engineering plant is worn out, operating at reduced efficiency because repairs can't be made while underway. The flight deck is scarred from hundreds of arrested landings. The arresting wires stretch beyond their design service life. The elevators are functioning but need major maintenance. The catapults are working but unreliable. The ship needs a month in a Navy yard for proper repairs and maintenance, but Enterprise can't be spared from operations. The naval battle of Guadalcanal in November proved that Japanese surface forces remain dangerous, and Enterprise is the only carrier available to counter potential Japanese naval operations. The decision finally comes in early April 1943. Enterprise will return to Pearl Harbor for repairs and crew rest. Admiral Halsey makes the call, recognizing that continuing operations will break the ship and crew beyond their ability to recover. The new Essex-class carriers are beginning to enter service, providing additional carrier capability that makes Enterprise less indispensable. Saratoga has returned from repairs and can cover operations until Enterprise returns. The decision is both relief and guilt for Enterprise's crew. Relief because they desperately need rest. Guilt because returning to Pearl Harbor feels like abandoning the Marines and soldiers still fighting on Guadalcanal and other Solomon Islands. The war won't stop just because Enterprise needs repairs. Enterprise departs the South Pacific on April 7th, heading east toward Pearl Harbor at a leisurely 20 knots. The crew slowly decompresses from 6 months of continuous combat operations. Gun crews secure weapons that have been manned continuously since October. The Damage Control Organization conducts maintenance on equipment that's been ready for immediate use since the ship entered the South Pacific. The Air Group flies training missions rather than combat missions, practicing procedures without the pressure of people shooting at them. The ship's galley serves hot meals instead of sandwiches grabbed between watches. Men sleep in their bunks instead of at their battle stations. The transition from combat to peacetime routine feels surreal, as if they've entered a different world where death isn't a constant possibility. Pearl Harbor appears on the horizon on April 27th, and Enterprise receives the homecoming she's earned. Every ship in the harbor sounds its whistle in salute as Enterprise passes. Sailors line the rails of battleships and cruisers, cheering and waving. The pier is crowded with thousands of people, families of crew members, Navy officials, reporters who want to document the return of America's most famous warship. The crew stands at parade formation on the flight deck, wearing dress whites that feel strange after months in combat gear. They're heroes, and the welcome makes that clear. But most of the crew feels uncomfortable with the attention. They did their jobs under impossible conditions, nothing more and nothing less. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come back, the names read at burial ceremonies over the side, the faces that appear in nightmares. The ship enters dry dock on April 29th for repairs that will take 3 months. The work list fills 200 pages, documenting every system that needs attention. The forward elevator will finally be replaced, the massive structure that's been welded over since Santa Cruz. The flight deck will be resurfaced, replacing the improvised patches installed at Noumea with proper repairs. The hull will be strengthened, adding plates and frames to areas weakened by repeated battle damage. The engineering plant will be overhauled, and replacing worn bearings and valves. The anti-aircraft battery will be upgraded, adding more 40mm and 20mm guns. The radar system will be improved, installing new equipment that provides better early warning. Enterprise will emerge from the repair period stronger than she's ever been, ready for the offensive operations that will characterize the second half of the Pacific War. The crew gets liberty for the first time in 7 months, and most men head straight for the Honolulu bars and restaurants they've been dreaming about during long nights at sea. Aviation machinist's mate, Bruno Guido, walks through Honolulu with friends from his maintenance division, drinking beer and eating steaks and trying to remember what normal life feels like. They've survived 6 months of continuous combat operations aboard a ship that was hit repeatedly and repaired, using whatever materials were available. They've watched friends die and helped pull wounded men from damaged aircraft. They've worked until exhaustion was the only sensation left, then kept working because the mission demanded it. Now they're safe, temporarily, and they don't quite know how to process the transition. Guido will have 3 months to rest before Enterprise returns to combat. In that 3 months, he'll be promoted to Aviation Machinist's Mate Chief, the highest enlisted rank in his rating. He'll be recommended for a commission as a warrant officer. And he'll volunteer for the raid on Truk that will get him killed, because despite everything he's experienced, yes, he still believes in the mission and still wants to contribute. But tonight, on April 29th, 1943, he's just a 23-year-old sailor drinking beer in Honolulu, grateful to be alive and trying not to think about going back. November 20th, 1943, Task Force 50, 200 miles northwest of Tarawa Atoll. The radar screen shows friendly contacts in every direction, a concentration of American naval power unprecedented in the Pacific War. Enterprise steams as part of a carrier task force that includes 11 carriers, 8 battleships, 12 cruisers, and 66 destroyers. It's the largest carrier force ever assembled, representing industrial might that Japan cannot match and will never match. The crew looks at the formation with satisfaction, mixed with surreal disbelief. 7 months ago, Enterprise was the only operational carrier in the Pacific, fighting alone, barely surviving. Now she's one of 11 carriers, part of an armada so powerful that it can attack any target in the Pacific with reasonable confidence of success. The war has changed fundamentally, shifted from desperate defense to overwhelming offense, and Enterprise's crew is still adapting to what that means. The mission is Operation Galvanic, the invasion of Tarawa and Makin in the Gilbert Islands. Enterprise's role is providing air cover for the amphibious landings, launching strikes against Japanese positions ashore, maintaining combat air patrol over the invasion fleet. It's the same mission Enterprise performed at Guadalcanal 15 months ago, but the scale is completely different. At Guadalcanal, the Enterprise protected the invasion fleet alone. Here, Enterprise is one of 4 fast carriers working together, coordinating strikes and sharing defensive responsibilities in ways that were impossible when carriers operated individually. The coordination requires new procedures and better communication, but it also means no single carrier carries the burden of the entire operation. The Air Group has changed as dramatically as the fleet composition. Air Group 10, which fought through the Guadalcanal campaign, has been replaced by Air Group 6. Most of the pilots are new, trained in the massive aviation training program that now produces hundreds of pilots monthly. They have more flight hours than the pilots who fought at Midway, better training in instruments and navigation, and aircraft that are superior to what their predecessors flew. The F-6F Hellcat fighter has replaced the obsolete F-4F Wildcat, giving American pilots an aircraft that can compete with the Zero on equal terms. The TBF Avenger torpedo bomber has replaced the death trap TBD Devastator, offering speed and defensive firepower that make torpedo attacks survivable. Even the SBD Dauntless dive bomber has been upgraded with more powerful engines and better radios. The strike launch on November 20th demonstrates the new coordination procedures. Enterprise launches 16 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 12 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and 12 F-6F Hellcat fighters at 0600 hours. The aircraft form up overhead, then join with strike groups from carriers Yorktown and Lexington, creating a combined force of 97 aircraft heading for Tarawa. The formation flies in coordinated elements, while fighters high and ahead, dive bombers at medium altitude, torpedo bombers low. They maintain radio discipline, using hand signals and formation position to communicate. It's professional and precise, the result of months of training and the hard lessons learned during 2 years of combat operations. The attack on Tarawa begins at 0715 with fighters strafing Japanese anti-aircraft positions to suppress defensive fire. The dive bombers follow 30 seconds later, pushing over into their attacks from 12,000 feet and placing bombs on Japanese bunkers and supply dumps. The torpedo bombers make low-level attack runs, dropping bombs rather than torpedoes because the targets are ashore and don't require torpedo attacks. The coordination is nearly perfect, at each element attacking in sequence to maximize damage and minimize exposure to defensive fire. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire is intense, but less effective than earlier in the war, the gunners unable to track multiple attacking elements simultaneously. Enterprise aircraft destroy 18 Japanese positions, losing 2 aircraft to anti-aircraft fire, a loss rate of 2% that reflects both improved tactics and degraded Japanese capabilities. The night attack on November 24th introduces a capability Enterprise has been developing since earlier in the year. 6 TBF Avengers equipped with radar and additional navigation equipment launch at 2100 hours to attack Japanese shipping near Tarawa. Night carrier operations are dangerous under ideal conditions, requiring precise navigation and instrument flying skills that most pilots lack. But Enterprise's night detachment has been training for months, practicing night launches and recoveries until the procedures become automatic. The night strike finds a Japanese convoy 40 miles north of Tarawa, illuminates the ships with flares, and sinks 2 transports. The recovery at 0100 hours goes smoothly despite darkness and a pitching deck, proving that carriers can operate effectively at night when properly trained. The contrast with earlier operations is stark and visible to anyone who fought through the dark days of 1942. Lieutenant Commander Edward Steichen, a renowned photographer now serving as a Navy commander documenting carrier operations, films Enterprise's flight deck operations during the Tarawa operation. His footage shows organized chaos that somehow produces consistent results. Aircraft launching every 45 seconds, landing every 30 seconds, moving through the complex choreography of carrier operations with practiced efficiency. Steichen interviews crew members about the differences between 1942 and 1943 operations. Chief Aviation Machinist's mate Richard Halstead, who's been aboard Enterprise since 1941, summarizes it simply. In 42, we were improvising everything and hoping we'd survive. In 43, we know what works and we have enough resources to do it properly. The strategic raid on Truk Lagoon in February 1944 represents the offensive capability Enterprise now possesses as part of Task Force 58. Truk is Japan's main forward naval base, and often called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, protected by hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and fighter aircraft. It's been untouchable throughout the war, too heavily defended for the small carrier forces available in 1942. But in February 1944, Task Force 58 brings 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers to attack Truk, overwhelming defenses through sheer numbers. Enterprise launches 3 strikes on February 17th, sending 90 aircraft against Truk in coordinated attacks that last throughout the day. The results exceed expectations. Enterprise aircraft sink 8 ships, totaling 43,000 tons, destroy 43 Japanese aircraft in the air and on the ground, and photograph Japanese installations that intelligence will study for months. The losses are acceptable: 4 aircraft and 6 aircrew from Enterprise, plus losses from other carriers that bring the total to 25 aircraft out of nearly 400 launched. It's a 1-to-10 exchange ratio, sustainable indefinitely, proof that American tactical doctrine and numerical superiority have created an overwhelming advantage. The Japanese can't defend Truk effectively because they don't have enough fighters to intercept massive strikes while maintaining reserves for follow-on attacks. The mathematics of carrier warfare have shifted decisively in America's favor. The night of February 17th brings Enterprise's most significant contribution to the Truk raid. Japanese aircraft attempt a counterattack against Task Force 58, launching torpedoes and dive bombers from Truk's remaining operational airfields. Enterprise's radar picks up the incoming raid at 40 miles, and the new Combat Information Center directs night fighters to intercept positions with precision impossible in 1942. Lieutenant Commander Richard Harmer, commanding Enterprise's night fighter detachment, shoots down 3 Japanese aircraft using his radar-equipped F-6F Hellcat. Other night fighters from Enterprise account for 4 more kills. The Combat Information Center's performance is revolutionary, demonstrating capabilities that will become standard throughout the fleet, but are cutting edge in February 1944. The success of the night interception comes from Enterprise being designated as a test platform for night operations development. The ship carries additional radar equipment and communication systems specifically for directing night fighters. The Combat Information Center crew has trained for months on intercepting aircraft in darkness, using radar plots and geometric calculations to position fighters for interceptions. The night fighter pilots have practiced until they can take off, fly intercepts, and land on a blacked-out carrier through pure instrument flying. It's specialized expertise that few carriers possess in 1944, making Enterprise valuable for reasons beyond just her combat power. She's a laboratory where new tactics are developed and tested before being distributed fleet-wide. The personnel rotation during the Central Pacific Campaign reflects maturation of the Navy's manpower system, and Enterprise is no longer losing experienced crew members without replacements. The Navy has established formal rotation policies that send veterans stateside to training commands after 18 months of combat duty, using their experience to train the next generation of sailors and aviators. New crew members arrive regularly, bringing fresh energy and recent training that incorporates the latest tactical developments. The veteran crew members teach the newcomers practical skills that can't be learned in training schools. How to sleep through the thunderous noise of flight operations. How to move efficiently through crowded passageways. How to maintain equipment under conditions that destroy training manuals' assumptions. Aviation Machinist's Mate, Chief Bruno Guido, exemplifies the rotation challenges. He's been aboard Enterprise since June 1941, participated in every major operation, earned promotion to Chief Petty Officer, and recommendation for Warrant Officer Commission. By February 1944, he's completed 30 months of sea duty and is eligible for rotation stateside to a training command, where he could pass his expertise to new mechanics. But Guido volunteers for every dangerous mission, refuses to take leave, and requests to remain aboard Enterprise despite being eligible for rotation. His division officer writes in Guido's fitness report, "Chief Guido is the finest aircraft mechanic I have known, and an inspiration to all hands." He refuses rest despite obvious fatigue because he believes his experience is needed in combat operations. The decision to include Guido in the February 17th strike against shipping near Truk violates normal procedures. Mechanics don't usually fly combat missions unless they're filling radio man/gunner positions in aircraft that are short-crewed. But Guido has requested to fly as a gunner, arguing that his maintenance expertise might help if an aircraft develops problems during the mission. Lieutenant Commander Edward Coleman, commanding Scouting Squadron 6, approves the request despite misgivings. Guido flies in the rear seat of an SBD Dauntless piloted by Ensign Frank O'Flaherty, a relatively inexperienced pilot with 3 months aboard Enterprise. The mission is supposed to be routine, but a search for Japanese shipping that might have escaped the previous day's attacks. The routine mission becomes disaster at 1420, when O'Flaherty's SBD is hit by anti-aircraft fire from a Japanese destroyer. The aircraft's engine is damaged, losing power and trailing smoke. O'Flaherty radios that he's ditching and broadcasts his position before the radio fails. The SBD hits the water at 80 miles per hour, the impact collapsing the landing gear and flooding the cockpit. O'Flaherty and Guido escape the sinking aircraft and inflate their life raft, watching the SBD disappear beneath the surface. They're 30 miles from Truk, surrounded by Japanese ships and aircraft, with no realistic chance of rescue by American forces. Other aircraft from the strike see them in the water, but can't land to attempt pickup. The Enterprise launches a PBY Catalina flying boat that night to search for them, but Japanese forces control the area, and the PBY finds nothing. O'Flaherty and Guido are captured by the Japanese destroyer Fumizuki on February 18th after drifting overnight in their life raft. They're taken to Truk, interrogated about American carrier operations, and held in the Japanese naval base prison facility. The interrogations are brutal, using methods that violate international law but are standard procedure for Japanese military intelligence. O'Flaherty provides only name, rank, and serial number. Guido does the same, despite being told that enlisted men have no protection under the Geneva Convention, a lie that the Japanese interrogators hope will break his resistance. Both men maintain discipline despite physical abuse and threats of execution. On June 15, 1944, after 4 months of imprisonment, O'Flaherty and Guido are taken aboard a Japanese vessel, weighted with chains and thrown overboard while still alive. They drown in water 2 miles deep, murdered in violation of every convention of warfare. Enterprise doesn't learn Guido's fate until after the war, when Japanese records are captured and interrogation reports discovered. The crew mourns him as they've mourned dozens of others, young men who went out on routine missions and never came back. Guido's posthumous, Distinguished Flying Cross recognizes his actions at the Eastern Solomons when he manned a machine gun and shot down a Japanese aircraft. But the decoration can't recognize what Guido represented: dedication that exceeded rational self-interest, competence that made Enterprise better, a courage that persisted until the moment Japanese sailors drowned him in the Pacific. He was 24 years old when he died, had been in the Navy for less than 4 years, and accomplished more in that time than most people accomplish in a lifetime. The Central Pacific Campaign continues through March and April 1944 without Enterprise, which returns to Pearl Harbor for a brief refit. The ship receives updated radar, additional anti-aircraft guns, and repairs to systems worn by continuous operations. The crew gets liberty and the Air Group rotates again, bringing aboard Air Group 20 with fresh pilots and newer aircraft. By May 1944, Enterprise is ready to return to combat, but now she's part of a carrier force so large that individual ships become less important than the collective capability. Task Force 58 includes 15 carriers by mid-1944, enough naval aviation to attack multiple targets simultaneously, to maintain continuous combat air patrols, to replace losses without degrading combat effectiveness. Enterprise is no longer indispensable because America has built enough carriers to make any single ship expendable. But Enterprise retains special status due to her combat record and specialized capabilities. She's the most experienced carrier in the Pacific Fleet, her crew veterans of more battles than any other ship. She's the primary test platform for night carrier operations, capabilities that will become increasingly important as the war progresses. And she's become a symbol, the Big E, the ship that fought when fighting seemed hopeless, survived when survival seemed impossible, and proved that American naval aviation could compete with and eventually dominate Japanese naval aviation. The crew takes pride in that reputation, understanding that they serve aboard something larger than just a ship. They serve aboard a legend that's still being written, and they're determined to ensure the legend ends with victory rather than defeat. The Central Pacific Campaign has shown that victory is possible, even probable. Now, the task is making it inevitable. June 19th, 1944, 10:05 hours. Task Force 58, 90 miles west of Guam. The radar screen shows what the Japanese call Operation A-Go, their last coordinated carrier offensive of the Pacific War, and what Enterprise's crew sees as target practice. The contacts appear at 150 miles, in a massive raid of 69 aircraft inbound from the west, where Japanese carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku are launching everything they have. The Combat Information Center goes to work with professional precision, plotting the raid's course and speed, calculating intercept points, and vectoring 40 F-6F Hellcat fighters to positions where they'll engage the Japanese formation before it reaches the American carriers. This is what 2 years of development has produced: an integrated air defense system where radar detection, fighter direction, and pilot skill combine to create nearly impenetrable defense. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, commanding a division of Hellcats from Fighting Squadron 16, receives vectors from Enterprise's Combat Information Center at 10:20 hours. The directions are crisp and accurate. Vector 270, Angels 20, Bandits your 12 o'clock 40 miles. Vrasiu acknowledges and leads his division west at full throttle, climbing to 20,000 feet. The visibility is unlimited, which favors the Hellcats that can spot targets from miles away. At 10:35, Vrasiu sees the Japanese formation. 45 Judy dive bombers in neat V formations at 18,000 feet. escorted by 24 Zero fighters at 22,000 feet. It's textbook Japanese doctrine, bombers in tight formation for mutual defensive fire, fighters positioned high to dive on attackers. Vratsu recognizes the formation from intelligence briefings and realizes the Japanese are flying exactly the way they flew in 1942. And though they haven't adapted while American tactics have evolved dramatically, Vratsu positions his division 5,000 feet above and behind the Japanese formation, in the classic bounce position where Hellcats can dive through with speed advantage. He signals attack and rolls into a steep dive that accelerates the Hellcat past 400 miles per hour. The approach is so fast that the Japanese fighters don't react until Vratsu is already firing at the bomber formation. His .650 caliber machine guns converge at 300 yards, creating a cone of fire that tears through one Judy's wing and fuselage. The bomber explodes, debris scattering across the sky. Vratsu pulls up, rolling to maintain sight of the formation, and spots another Judy slightly separated from the main body. He attacks from astern, firing a 3-second burst that hits the Judy's engine and cockpit. The bomber noses over and begins its death dive toward the ocean 4 miles below. The entire engagement lasts 8 minutes. Vratsu shoots down 6 Judy dive bombers, emptying his ammunition in 6 separate attacks. Other Hellcats from Enterprise and other carriers tear through the Japanese formation with similar results. The Japanese lose 42 aircraft from the first raid without a single bomb reaching the American carriers. The survivors turn back toward their carriers, radioing that they've been intercepted by overwhelming fighter opposition. On Enterprise's flag bridge, Admiral Mark Mitcher receives the combat reports and allows himself a tight smile. This is what he's been building toward for 2 years. A defense so effective that Japanese attacks achieve nothing while suffering catastrophic losses. The second Japanese raid arrives at 1300 hours, 47 aircraft attempting to attack the carriers from a different direction. Enterprise's Combat Information Center tracks them from 130 miles, vectoring fighters to intercept positions, while the raid is still 70 miles from the task force. The Hellcats engage at maximum range, using their superior speed and climb rate to bounce the Japanese formation from above. Lieutenant, junior grade, George Blair shoots down 4 aircraft in 5 minutes, exhausting his ammunition before the Japanese reach attack position. Ensign Wilbur Webb gets 3 kills in a running battle that extends across 20 miles of ocean. The collective slaughter is so one-sided that pilots begin calling it the Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that will stick and become the battle's unofficial designation. By 1400 hours, the Japanese have launched a third raid, 29 aircraft that represent their last available strike force. These aircraft face the same integrated defense that destroyed the first 2 raids. Early radar detection, precision fighter direction, overwhelming numbers of well-trained pilots flying superior aircraft. The result is equally catastrophic. 27 of 29 aircraft are shot down, and the 2 survivors return to their carriers too damaged to be repaired. The Japanese have launched 145 aircraft against Task Force 58 and lost 116, an attrition rate of 80% that no Air Force can sustain. Enterprise's fighters account for 31 confirmed kills without losing a single aircraft to Japanese fighters. It's the most lopsided air combat victory in naval history, validation of every tactical improvement developed since 1942. The success reflects technological and training advantages that have accumulated over 2 years of combat. The F-6F Hellcat is faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than the Zero. American pilots receive 350 hours of flight training before joining combat squadrons, compared to Japanese pilots who now receive less than 100 hours due to fuel shortages and compressed training schedules. The Combat Information Center on Enterprise represents hundreds of hours of training and refinement, now with radar operators and fighter directors who can manage 40 aircraft simultaneously. The radio equipment is reliable and clear, allowing precise communication that was impossible in 1942. Even the ammunition is better, using improved powder that gives the .50 caliber machine guns greater range and hitting power. But the most important advantage is institutional learning. Enterprise's Air Group in June 1944 benefits from every lesson learned since December 1941. The Fighter Tactics Manual incorporates techniques developed by dozens of squadrons over hundreds of engagements. The fighter direction procedures reflect refinements made after every battle where defenses succeeded or failed. The pilots have studied gun camera film from earlier engagements, at learning what works and what doesn't from predecessors who paid for that knowledge with their lives. The Japanese, by contrast, have lost most of their experienced pilots and haven't had time to develop and distribute new tactics. They're fighting with 1942 doctrine against an enemy that's evolved far beyond what they faced at Coral Sea or Midway. The afternoon brings opportunity that Admiral Mitcher debates with his staff for hours. American submarines have reported the Japanese carrier's approximate position, 275 miles northwest of Task Force 58. Launching a strike at that range means aircraft will return after dark, requiring night recoveries that will be dangerous even with Enterprise's specialized night operations capability. Many pilots in the task force have never landed aboard at night and will crash attempting it. But not attacking means the Japanese carriers escape to fight another day. Mitcher weighs the options, consults with his carrier captains, and makes the decision that defines his aggressive command style. Launch everything we have, worry about recovery later. Enterprise launches her strike at 16:20 hours, part of a combined force of 216 aircraft from all carriers and Task Force 58. The strike includes 24 SBD, Dauntless dive bombers, 18 TBF, Avenger torpedo bombers, and 12 F-6F, Hellcat fighters from Enterprise. Lieutenant Commander James Minnie leads Enterprise's strike group, navigating by dead reckoning toward coordinates that are estimates based on submarine reports hours old. Now the flight takes nearly 90 minutes, the sun sinking toward the western horizon, while Minnie recalculates his navigation repeatedly, knowing that finding the carriers before fuel exhaustion forces returns is critical. At 18:25, Minnie spots the Japanese fleet, 3 carriers surrounded by battleships and cruisers, turning into the wind to launch defensive fighters. The attack develops with the coordination that Task Force 58 has practiced for months. Torpedo bombers attack from both sides simultaneously, forcing the carriers to maneuver in ways that make them vulnerable to dive bombers attacking from above. Enterprise's SBDs roll into their attacks against carrier Zuikaku, pushing over from 10,000 feet into 70-degree dives that bring them through surprisingly light anti-aircraft fire. Then the Japanese gunners are exhausted from a day of continuous alerts and uncoordinated in their defensive fire. Enterprise's dive bombers score 2 direct hits on Zuikaku, starting fires that will eventually force the carrier's abandonment. Other carriers in Task Force 58 hit Hio and Ryuho, sinking the former and damaging the latter. In 30 minutes, the American strike destroys or damages 3 Japanese carriers, completing the job begun by the morning's defensive slaughter. The return flight becomes an epic of navigation and survival. The sun sets at 1900 hours, leaving the returning strike aircraft flying through darkness toward carriers that are running away from them to stay beyond Japanese submarine range. Many pilots have never flown instruments at night and begin making navigation errors that take them away from the task force. The fuel gauges drop toward empty, and pilots begin calculating whether they'll reach the carriers or ditch in the ocean. Some elect to ditch early, landing in the water while they still have control authority and hoping destroyers will find them. Others press on, gambling that they can find the carriers before fuel exhaustion forces uncontrolled crashes. Admiral Mitcher makes the decision that saves dozens of lives but violates every doctrine about carrier operations at night. At 2000 hours, he orders all ships in Task Force 58 to turn on their lights, illuminating themselves for any Japanese submarine that might be watching. The risk is enormous because lighted ships are perfect torpedo targets, but the alternative is losing most of the strike group, and Mitcher values pilots more than he fears submarines. Enterprise and the other carriers turn on their lights, creating a beacon visible for 50 miles. The returning aircraft home on the lights, arriving over the task force in 1s and 2s, exhausted and low on fuel, The recovery becomes controlled chaos as carriers land aircraft in darkness despite lacking proper equipment or procedures for night operations. Enterprise recovers 43 aircraft between 2015 and 2100 hours, a combination of her own aircraft and strays from other carriers that land on the first deck they find. 6 aircraft crash on landing, their pilots too exhausted or fuel-starved to execute proper approaches. DICE 4 aircraft ditch alongside Enterprise after running out of fuel on final approach. Their crews rescued by destroyers despite darkness and rough seas. One pilot makes 3 landing attempts before finally catching a wire on his 4th try, landing with less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining. The flight deck crew works miracles, clearing crashed aircraft in minutes, maintaining recovery operations despite conditions that would normally shut down flight operations. By 2200 hours, the recovery is complete, and the accounting begins. Task Force 58 lost 20 aircraft to combat and 80 to operational causes, primarily fuel exhaustion and night landing accidents. But the pilots and aircrew are mostly recovered, destroyers searching throughout the night and picking up men from life rafts. The Japanese lost 3 carriers and 600 aircraft, counting both the defensive battle and the strike losses. More importantly, they've lost the air groups that manned those carriers, veteran pilots and air crew who cannot be replaced. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, officially, or the Marianas Turkey Shoot, colloquially, represents the decisive end of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. They'll continue to operate carriers through the rest of the war, but never again will they launch coordinated multi-carrier strikes or threaten American carrier task forces. Enterprise's role in the battle showcases her evolution from desperate survivor to professional killer. The Combat Information Center directed fighters with precision impossible in 1942, as the air group executed coordinated strikes that reflected 2 years of tactical refinement. The night operations capability saved dozens of pilots who would have died without the specialized equipment and training Enterprise possesses. Captain Matthias Gardner, commanding Enterprise since April, writes in his after-action report, "Enterprise's performance at Philippine Sea represents the culmination of 30 months of combat experience. We have learned how to fight carriers effectively, and the Japanese have not adapted to our improvements." The crew's reaction to the Turkey Shoot is satisfaction rather than jubilation. They've proven American naval aviation's superiority decisively, but they've also seen friends crash on night landings and watched pilots ditch from fuel exhaustion. That victory has costs even when the exchange ratio is 10-1 in America's favor. Aviation Ordnance Man at Second Class Robert Humphrey, who's been loading bombs onto SBDs for 2 years, summarizes the crew's perspective simply: "We beat them bad today, but people still died. Winning doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." The philosophical observation reflects maturity earned through prolonged combat. The crew understands that victory and tragedy coexist, that winning battles doesn't eliminate death, and that the war will continue despite today's overwhelming success. Philippine Sea is decisive, but it's not final. Enterprise will fight many more battles before the war ends, and some of those battles will be far more costly than the Turkey Shoot, October 30th, 1944. 0250 hours. Task Force 38. As 40 miles east of Samar Island, the General Quarters alarm shatters the pre-dawn darkness, sending Enterprise's crew racing to battle stations for the 4th time in 6 hours. Radar has detected aircraft inbound from the west, range 30 miles, and closing. Almost certainly Japanese attackers hunting for the carriers supporting the Leyte Gulf invasion. This raid is different from the conventional attacks Enterprise has defeated throughout the day. These aircraft aren't maneuvering for optimal attack position or maintaining defensive formations. They're flying directly toward the task force at maximum speed, and the Combat Information Center's analysis suggests something has changed fundamentally in Japanese tactics. The Fighter Direction Officer vectors 8F-6F, Hellcats toward the incoming raid, but there's tension in his voice that wasn't present during earlier intercepts. Something about this attack feels wrong. The kamikazes arrive at 0310 hours, 4 Mitsubishi A-6M0, fighters each carrying a 250-kilogram bomb externally. They've been launched from Mabalacat Airfield on Luzon as part of the newly formed Kamikaze Special Attack Corps, Japan's desperate response to losing the pilot-quality war. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi created the kamikaze units 3 weeks ago, recognizing that poorly trained Japanese pilots cannot hit carriers using conventional attacks, but might succeed through suicide crashes. The mathematics are brutal but effective. 1 plane, 1 pilot, 1 bomb equals 1 potential carrier kill. The kamikaze pilots are mostly teenagers with less than 100 hours flight training. AI young men who've volunteered or been volunteered for missions that have no return flight planned. They've been told they're saving Japan, defending their families, achieving glory through sacrifice. They believe it enough to point their aircraft at Enterprise and never deviate. The Hellcats engage 20 miles from the task force, diving into the kamikaze formation and opening a fire. Lieutenant, junior grade, Douglas Baker shoots down 1-0, watching it explode in a fireball that lights up the pre-dawn darkness. Ensign Norman Burns destroys another with a deflection shot that severs the Zero's tail. But the remaining 2 kamikazes continue toward Enterprise, ignoring the fighters attacking them, focused solely on reaching the carrier. One takes hits that would force any rational pilot to break off the attack. Now the Zero's engine smoking and control surfaces damaged, but the pilot maintains course. The concept is alien to American tactical doctrine, where survival allows pilots to fight another day. These pilots aren't trying to survive. They're trying to die in ways that kill Americans, and that single-minded focus makes them terrifying opponents. The first kamikaze reaches Enterprise at 03:15, diving through anti-aircraft fire that fills the sky with tracers and exploding shells. Captain Matthias Gardner throws Enterprise into a hard turn, maximum rudder deflection, trying to present the smallest possible target. The 5-inch guns fire continuously, their shells creating black puffs around the diving Zero. The 40mm Bofors guns walk tracers across the sky, catching the Zero with multiple hits that should down the aircraft. The 20mm Oerlikon cannons fire at maximum rate, their high-pitched chatter creating a continuous roar. The kamikaze takes dozens of hits, pieces of aircraft tearing away, smoke trailing from the engine, but still the Zero comes on. At the last moment, the pilot adjusts his dive angle slightly, aiming for Enterprise's island structure. The Zero hits the deck edge forward of the island at 03:16, the impact crushing the aircraft and detonating both the Zero's fuel and the bomb it carries. The explosion tears a hole in the flight deck and sends fragments through the forward gallery deck, where gun crews are manning their stations. 13 men die instantly, killed by blast effects or shrapnel. The fires start immediately, all aviation fuel from the Zero splashing across the deck and igniting. The wooden flight deck planking burns fiercely, temperatures reaching levels that soften the steel deck beneath. Damage control parties respond within seconds, dragging fire hoses forward and spraying fog patterns that cool the fire and displace oxygen. They're wearing oxygen-breathing apparatus because the smoke is toxic, working in conditions where visibility is measured in inches. The damage is serious, but not catastrophic. The hole in the flight deck is 8 feet in diameter, smaller than the bomb damage at Santa Cruz, but positioned in a location that complicates flight operations. The gallery deck has structural damage and several gun mounts are destroyed. The fires are brought under control within 30 minutes. Though hotspots continue burning for hours in spaces that are difficult to access. Enterprise can still operate, can still launch and recover aircraft, but she's wounded in a new way. This wasn't a bomb that missed its target and happened to hit close. This was a pilot who deliberately crashed into Enterprise, using his aircraft as a guided missile that conventional defenses couldn't stop. The psychological impact on the crew is profound. How do you defend against attackers who view death as mission success rather than mission failure? The tactical briefing at 0800 hours attempts to make sense of what happened. Commander William Ellis, the air operations officer, explains what intelligence has learned about kamikaze tactics. Japanese pilots are deliberately crashing into American ships, essentially turning themselves into guided bombs. The attack started on October 25th when kamikazes sank the escort carrier St. Lo and damage several other ships. The tactic is spreading because it's effective and requires minimal pilot training. A pilot who can take off and fly straight can execute a kamikaze attack. No need for complex navigation, bombing accuracy, or defensive maneuvering. Just point the aircraft at a ship and maintain course until impact. The simplicity is terrifying because it means Japan can continue attacking even after losing most of its experienced pilots. Enterprise remains on station off Leyte despite the damage, conducting flight operations from the aft portion of the flight deck while repair crews work on the forward section. The operational tempo doesn't allow time for proper repairs. So the crew improvises with materials available aboard ship. Carpenters cut wooden planks to replace the burned flight deck sections. Welders fabricate steel plates to cover damaged areas in the gallery deck. Electricians splice severed cables and restore power to damaged systems. It's the same improvisation Enterprise has practiced since Santa Cruz 2 years ago, making do with whatever is available because proper repairs would require returning to a Navy yard, and Enterprise can't be spared from combat operations. The psychological toll of kamikaze attacks becomes apparent over the following weeks, as Enterprise continues supporting the Leyte operation. The crew develops a hypervigilance that extends beyond normal combat alertness. Gun crews scan the sky constantly, seeing threats in every aircraft that approaches the task force. Radar operators report contacts with urgency that reflects their awareness that any contact might be a kamikaze. Fighter directors vector fighters aggressively toward any unidentified aircraft, knowing that missing one kamikaze could mean hundreds of casualties. Sleep becomes difficult for many crew members, particularly those who witnessed the October 30th attack. They replay the engagement in their minds, seeing the Zero coming through the anti-aircraft fire, wondering what they could have done differently. November 25th brings the attack that proves kamikaze tactics are more than isolated incidents, that Japan has committed to suicide attacks as standard doctrine. Enterprise is conducting flight operations 70 miles east of Luzon when radar detects multiple raids inbound from different directions. The Combat Information Center's plot shows 8 separate groups, totaling 40-plus aircraft, converging on Task Force 38 from all compass points. It's a coordinated mass kamikaze attack designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers. Some kamikazes will be shot down, but statistics guarantee some will penetrate to the carriers. The question isn't whether Enterprise will be attacked, but whether the defenses can prevent catastrophic damage. The fighter direction officer launches every available Hellcat, 32 fighters that climb to altitude and position themselves to intercept the incoming raids. The Combat Information Center vectors fighters to intercept positions, but managing 32 fighters against 8 separate raids stretches the system beyond designed capacity. Some raids are intercepted successfully, with fighters shooting down kamikazes before they reach the task force. Other raids penetrate through the fighter screen, either by luck or by exploiting gaps in the defensive coverage. By 0900 hours, 5 kamikazes have reached the task force and are diving on individual carriers. Enterprise is not their primary target this time. Intrepid and Cabot both take kamikaze hits, explosions tearing through their flight decks and starting fires that will require hours to control. Enterprise's crew watches sister carriers burning and recognizes their own vulnerability. The kamikaze threat cannot be eliminated through conventional defensive measures. Shooting down 99% of attackers means nothing if the remaining 1% hits vital areas. The 5-inch guns can't track aircraft in steep dives, but the 40mm and 20mm guns lack the range to engage before kamikazes reach attack position. Fighters can intercept many attacks, but can't maintain perfect defensive coverage against raids coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The mathematics are unfavorable, and everyone aboard Enterprise knows it. They're professionals who understand statistics, and the statistics say that eventually Enterprise will take another kamikaze hit, probably multiple hits, and the damage might be catastrophic. The Philippines campaign continues through December and January with near-daily kamikaze attacks against Task Force 38. Enterprise adopts defensive measures that reduce but don't eliminate the threat. The combat air patrol is increased to 48 fighters maintained continuously, triple the normal coverage. The radar operators are instructed to report any contact immediately, accepting false alarms as preferable to missing genuine threats. The anti-aircraft gun crews maintain heightened readiness throughout daylight hours, knowing that kamikazes can appear with minimal warning. The ship conducts continuous evasive maneuvers during flight operations, making herself a more difficult target even though the maneuvering complicates aircraft launches and recoveries. The crew develops dark humor as a coping mechanism for the constant threat. Sailors refer to kamikazes as flying trash cans or Tojo's taxis, diminishing the threat through mockery. The gun crews paint kill markings on their weapons for every kamikaze shot down, creating competition between gun stations. The fighter pilots develop informal scoring systems, or awarding bonus points for shooting down kamikazes before they reach the outer defensive ring. The humor is defensive, a way of processing fear that cannot be expressed directly in a military culture that values stoicism. But beneath the humor is genuine anxiety that accumulates with each near miss and each time a neighboring carrier takes a hit. April 11th, 1945, brings the attack Enterprise cannot evade. The ship is supporting operations off Okinawa, launching strikes against Japanese positions ashore, while maintaining defensive patrols overhead. At 0650 hours, a single Mitsubishi, A6M0, appears out of the morning sun, diving toward Enterprise from 12,000 feet. The approach is perfectly executed, using the sun to blind lookouts and gun crews. The Combat Information Center has no warning because the Zero is part of a larger raid that drew off most of the combat air patrol. The anti-aircraft guns open fire at 3,000 feet, too late to prevent the attack. The 40mm guns score multiple hits but don't down the Zero. The 20mm guns fire frantically as the Zero enters terminal dive, but the kamikaze is committed and nothing will stop him now. The Zero crashes into the forward elevator at 0652, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the gallery deck below. The blast kills 13 men instantly and wounds 68 others. The forward elevator is destroyed completely, blown off its guides and twisted into scrap metal. The gallery deck is ripped open, exposing interior spaces to the elements. Fires start in multiple compartments, each fed by aviation fuel from the Zero, and ignited by electrical sparks from severed cables. The damage is worse than the October kamikaze hit, because the impact point is more critical. The forward elevator handles 40% of Enterprise's aircraft movement between hangar and flight decks. Without it, Enterprise's sortie rate drops by half. She can still operate, but at greatly reduced capacity. Captain Grover Hall, commanding Enterprise since January, faces the same decision every carrier captain dreads after major damage. Does Enterprise continue operations or withdraw for repairs? The damage assessment indicates the forward elevator cannot be repaired at sea. The structural damage is too extensive. And proper repair requires a Navy yard, with heavy lifting equipment and replacement parts that don't exist outside Pearl Harbor or the West Coast. But withdrawing means reducing Task Force 58's strength by one carrier during the critical Okinawa operation. Hall consults with Admiral Mitcher, who makes the decision. Enterprise withdraws to Ulithi Atoll for emergency repairs, then returns to Pearl Harbor for proper repair. The war will continue without Enterprise because by April 1945, the Navy has enough carriers that losing one temporarily doesn't cripple operations. The voyage to Ulithi takes 4 days, Enterprise maintaining 18 knots while damage control parties stabilize the damaged areas and prepare for emergency repairs. The crew's mood is subdued, mixing relief at leaving the combat zone with frustration at being forced out of action by a single kamikaze. They've survived 3 years of combat, participated in nearly every major battle of the Pacific War, and now they're heading for repairs because a teenager in a Zero decided to die killing Americans. There's no glory in this kind of damage, no dramatic battle story to tell. Just a sudden explosion, friends dead, and the ship limping away from combat. It's anticlimactic and depressing, the reality that war doesn't end with decisive battles but grinds on through attrition and cumulative damage. The emergency repairs at Ulithi last 2 weeks, repair ship USS Vestal, once again working miracles with inadequate equipment. The forward elevator is welded over with steel plates, just as it was after Santa Cruz 30 months earlier. The gallery deck is patched sufficiently to be weathertight. The damaged gun mounts are replaced with spares scavenged from other ships. By May 1st, Enterprise is seaworthy enough to transit to Pearl Harbor for proper repairs. The voyage takes 8 days at cruising speed, giving the crew time to decompress from 5 months of continuous operations off the Philippines and Okinawa. They've been at battle stations or modified alert for 147 consecutive days, sleeping in shifts, eating cold meals, living with the constant awareness that the next kamikaze might hit Enterprise and kill them. Pearl Harbor appears on May 9th, and Enterprise receives the welcome reserved for returning warriors. Ships in the harbor sound their whistles. Sailors line the rails and cheer. The pier is crowded with families and Navy personnel who recognize Enterprise as the most decorated warship in American naval history. But the welcome feels hollow to many crew members. They're returning for repairs caused by kamikaze damage, not returning victorious. The war continues without them, other carriers fighting off Okinawa while Enterprise sits in dry dock. There's guilt in that, the feeling that they're abandoning the fight while others continue to risk their lives. Captain Hall addresses the crew on May 10th, acknowledging their feelings, but emphasizing that ships require maintenance and crews require rest. Enterprise will return to combat after repairs, he promises, and the crew will have another chance to contribute to victory. The repairs take 3 months, June through August 1945. The forward elevator is completely replaced, a massive undertaking requiring cutting away the damaged structure and installing new equipment. The flight deck is resurfaced, replacing the patchwork of repairs accumulated over 3 years with proper steel decking. The hull is inspected thoroughly, revealing stress cracks and metal fatigue that require extensive reinforcement. The engineering plant is overhauled, replacing worn components and upgrading systems. The crew rotates partially, with veterans who've completed 36 months of sea duty transferring stateside and new sailors arriving to fill their places. By August 1st, Enterprise is structurally sound and ready to return to combat. But the war doesn't wait for Enterprise. On August 6th, an atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima. On August 9th, a second bomb destroys Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan surrenders unconditionally, ending the Pacific War before Enterprise can return to combat. The crew receives the news with emotions too complex to describe simply. Relief that the war is over, that they've survived. Disappointment that Enterprise wasn't present for the final operations. Satisfaction that their 3 years of combat contributed to victory even if they missed the ending. And underneath everything, exhaustion so profound that some men cry when they realize they don't have to go back into combat, don't have to face kamikazes again, don't have to wonder if today is the day they die. The war is over, and Enterprise has survived. That's enough. September 2nd, 1945. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Enterprise swings at anchor in Pearl Harbor while across the Pacific. And representatives of the Empire of Japan sign surrender documents aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The ceremony happens without Enterprise, the ship that fought from the war's beginning to nearly its end, now sitting idle while Missouri receives the honor of hosting the surrender. There's irony in this that Enterprise's crew appreciates with dark humor. Missouri has been in the Pacific for less than a year, participated in a handful of operations, and receives the glory. Enterprise has been fighting for nearly 4 years, participated in 20 major battles, earned 20 battle stars, and watches the war end from 8,000 miles away. But the crew understands that symbolism matters in ways different from combat effectiveness. Missouri is the newest battleship, representing American industrial might. The Enterprise is a scarred veteran whose presence would remind everyone how close America came to losing this war. Captain Grover Hall addresses the crew on September 3rd, explaining what comes next for Enterprise and her people. The Navy is demobilizing rapidly, reducing the fleet from wartime strength to whatever peacetime strength Congress authorizes. Enterprise will not be decommissioned immediately because the Navy needs carriers to support occupation forces in Japan and transport returning servicemen home. Operation Magic Carpet, the program to bring troops home from overseas, requires every available transport ship and carriers make excellent transports when their hangars are converted to berthing spaces. Enterprise will spend the next 6 months ferrying soldiers and sailors from Pacific bases to West Coast ports. Unglamorous work that's nevertheless important to men who've been overseas for years and want nothing more than to go home. The conversion begins in September. Enterprise's hangar deck transformed into temporary berthing, with bunks stacked 3 high and minimal amenities. The ship can carry 1,400 passengers in addition to her crew, cramming people into every available space. The aircraft are offloaded to shore bases, the hangar deck cleared of all equipment except what's needed to support the passengers. Galley facilities are expanded to feed the additional mouths. Sanitation facilities are upgraded to handle the increased load. Medical facilities are prepared to handle the inevitable injuries and illnesses that occur when you confine thousands of men in close quarters for weeks at a time. It's a massive logistical undertaking that transforms a warship into a troop ship in less than a month. The first Magic Carpet voyage departs Pearl Harbor on October 1st. Enterprise carrying 1,200 soldiers from the Army's 7th Infantry Division who've been in the Pacific since Guadalcanal. The soldiers are grateful for transportation home, but uncomfortable aboard a Navy ship, where everything operates by unfamiliar rules. The Navy crew is equally uncomfortable with Army passengers who don't understand shipboard life and violate protocols constantly. The combination creates friction that the ship's officers manage by keeping everyone busy. The soldiers conduct physical training on the flight deck. The Navy crew maintains the ship and conducts drills. Everyone attends mandatory lectures on transition to civilian life. They're preparing for the adjustments they'll face when they finally get home. The voyage to San Francisco takes 9 days at cruising speed, Enterprise no longer maintaining the wartime urgency that pushed her to the maximum speed. The Pacific is safe now. No submarines hunting American shipping. No kamikazes waiting to attack. The crew slowly adjusts to this reality, learning to relax vigilance that's been constant for 4 years. Gun crews stand down from continuous manning. Radar operators monitor for navigation hazards rather than enemy aircraft. The Combat Information Center, once the nerve center coordinating defensive operations, becomes a navigation aid tracking the ship's progress across a peaceful ocean. The transition is disorienting for crew members who've known nothing but combat operations since joining Enterprise. That San Francisco Bay appears on October 10th, the Golden Gate Bridge spanning the entrance in afternoon sunlight. Enterprise passes under the bridge, crew and passengers lining the rails to watch. For many Army soldiers, this is their first sight of America in 2 or 3 years. Some cry openly at seeing home. Others stand silently, processing emotions too complex for words. The Navy crew watches the passengers' reactions and recognizes their own feelings reflected back. They've been fighting this war for 4 years, most of them joining Enterprise as teenagers and now being discharged as 20-something veterans. They're different people than they were in December 1941, shaped by experiences that civilians cannot understand and will never fully appreciate. The ship docks at Pier 39, the same pier where Enterprise loaded supplies before deploying to the Pacific in 1941. The passengers disembark quickly, eager to reach processing centers and begin their journeys home. They thank the Navy crew perfunctorily, not understanding what these sailors have endured or accomplished. The crew watches them go with mixed feelings, pride in having contributed to victory by bringing these soldiers home, resentment that their service is ending not with glory, but with ferry missions, relief that the war is over and they'll soon be going home themselves. The emotional complexity reflects the challenge of transitioning from wartime purpose to peacetime uncertainty. Enterprise makes 6 Magic Carpet voyages between October 1945 and January 1946, or transporting 8,000 servicemen from Pacific bases to West Coast ports. The voyages blur together into routine: load passengers, transit ocean, offload passengers, reload supplies, repeat. It's monotonous work that lacks the meaning of combat operations. The crew's morale declines as the reality sinks in that this is how Enterprise's war ends, not with a climactic battle, but with routine transport missions. Some crew members request early discharge, eager to return to civilian life. Others volunteer to stay aboard, unwilling to leave Enterprise even though her glory days are finished. The ship becomes a community divided between those ready to move forward and those unable to let go of what was. The decommissioning rumors begin in February 1946, an unofficial scuttlebutt that spreads through the crew and proves accurate when official announcement arrives in March. Enterprise will be decommissioned and placed in reserve, joining dozens of other carriers made obsolete by the Navy's post-war reorganization. The decision makes practical sense because Enterprise is a pre-war design, smaller and less capable than the new Essex-class and Midway-class carriers. But it feels like betrayal to crew members who believe Enterprise deserves better than mothballs. They begin a campaign to save the ship, writing letters to Congress and newspapers, organizing veteran groups, arguing that Enterprise should be preserved as a museum ship, honoring her unmatched combat record. The campaign gains support from surprising sources. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded the Pacific Fleet throughout the war, endorses preserving Enterprise as a memorial. Admiral William Halsey, who commanded Enterprise during the desperate days of 1942, testifies before Congress that Enterprise represents America's determination to fight when fighting seemed hopeless. Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, acknowledges Enterprise's unique status, but notes that preserving a ship requires funding that Congress must appropriate. The political process grinds slowly while Enterprise sits in reserve, waiting for a decision about her ultimate fate. The years pass without resolution. Enterprise remains in reserve at Bayonne, New Jersey, maintained at minimum preservation level while veteran groups lobby for museum status. Korean War veterans point out that Enterprise could be reactivated for combat operations if properly modernized. Preservation advocates counter that Enterprise's historical significance exceeds her military utility. The debate continues through the 1950s while Enterprise deteriorates from neglect. The wooden flight deck rots in areas where rain penetrates. The steel hull develops rust that spreads beneath the paint. The machinery sits idle, degrading from lack of use. The ship that survived 3 years of combat is being destroyed by bureaucratic inaction. The final betrayal comes in 1958 when the Navy announces Enterprise will be sold for scrap. The decision triggers protests from veteran groups who've spent 12 years fighting to save the ship. Congress holds hearings where veterans testify about Enterprise's combat record and historical importance. But the funding never materializes, and the political will to preserve Enterprise doesn't exist. On July 1, 1958, Enterprise is sold to Lipset Inc. for $561,333. The ship that cost $18 million to build and earned 20 battle stars will be cut apart and sold as scrap metal. The irony is lost on nobody. Enterprise survived everything the Japanese threw at her, but couldn't survive peacetime bureaucracy. The scrapping begins in 1959 at Kearney, New Jersey. Workers cut Enterprise apart systematically, separating steel by grade and type for resale to mills. The flight deck comes off first, the wooden planking stripped away to expose steel beneath. The island structure is cut at the base and lifted off by crane. The hangar deck is cleared of all internal structures, creating an empty shell. The hull is cut into sections, each piece loaded onto trucks and transported to scrap yards. It takes 14 months to completely dismantle Enterprise, erasing physical evidence of her existence except for artifacts salvaged by veterans who cannot bear to see everything destroyed. Some pieces survive through unofficial channels. A section of flight deck becomes a memorial at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. A propeller is displayed at the Intrepid Sea, Air and Space Museum in New York. The ship's bell is preserved at the U.S. Naval Academy Museum. And now the stern plate bearing Enterprise's name and hull number is saved by veterans who claim it before the scrapping crews can destroy it. These fragments represent all that remains physically of Enterprise, scattered relics of a ship that once ruled the Pacific and earned the title the Gray Ghost for her ability to survive impossible odds. The name transfers to CVN-65, the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, commissioned in November 1961. The new Enterprise is larger, faster, and more powerful than the old, representing the Navy's future while honoring its past. But the new ship isn't the old Enterprise, doesn't carry the battle scars, or the history, or the spirit that made CV-6 special. Veterans of the old Enterprise attend the new ship's commissioning and politely acknowledge the connection, but privately they know the real Enterprise died in a scrapyard in New Jersey, cut apart and melted down to make refrigerators and automobiles. The name survives, but the ship is gone, erased from everything except memory and photographs and the combat reports that document her unmatched service. The final accounting of Enterprise's service fills volumes of official records. 20 major battles from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, 111,000 combat sorties flown, 911 enemy aircraft destroyed, 71 ships sunk, 192 damaged, 20 battle stars, more than any other American warship, Presidential Unit Citation, Navy Unit Commendation, or the statistics document effectiveness but cannot capture what Enterprise meant to the men who served aboard her, or the role she played in America's darkest hours of the Pacific War. She was the ship that fought when America had nothing else to fight with, survived when survival seemed impossible, and proved that determination and skill could overcome numerical inferiority. 485 men died serving aboard Enterprise during World War II, killed by combat action or operational accidents or disease contracted during prolonged deployments. Each death was individual tragedy, a family destroyed and a future erased. The casualties represent roughly 10% of the men who served aboard Enterprise during the war, a number that seems small statistically, but enormous personally. Every man aboard knew someone who died, or attended burial services where bodies slid into the Pacific and carried memories of lost friends throughout their lives. The dead remained forever young, while the survivors aged, carrying guilt that they lived while others didn't. The survivors scattered after the war, returning to civilian lives in small towns and large cities across America. Some succeeded in business or professions, building families and careers that honored the second chance they received. Others struggled with what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, unable to reconcile combat experiences with civilian life's mundane concerns. Many stayed connected through veteran organizations, attending reunions where they could talk with people who understood what they'd experienced. They aged together, watching each other develop gray hair and health problems, knowing that eventually the last survivor would die, and Enterprise's story would pass from living memory into history. The legacy remains despite physical destruction and passing generations. Enterprise proved that carrier-based aviation could dominate naval warfare, validating decisions made in the 1920s and 30s when carrier development was controversial. She demonstrated that well-trained crews using adequate equipment could defeat numerically superior enemies through superior tactics and determination. She showed that ships could absorb enormous damage and survive if damage control was properly trained and equipped. These lessons, paid for in blood during Enterprise's combat operations, shaped naval doctrine for decades and continue influencing naval aviation today. And the spirit of Enterprise lives in the nuclear carrier that bears her name and in the institutional memory of the U.S. Navy. New sailors hear stories about the Big E, the carrier that fought every major battle of the Pacific War and emerged victorious despite impossible odds. The stories inspire when sailors face challenges and need reminders that determination overcomes adversity. Enterprise becomes legend, the ship that couldn't be sunk, the crew that refused to give up, the symbol of American naval power at its finest. Whether the legend matches reality is almost irrelevant because the legend serves purposes that reality cannot. It reminds us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when circumstances demand it, that survival requires both skill and luck. One that history remembers not just victory, but the cost of achieving it. On December the 7th, 2012, the 71st anniversary of Pearl Harbor, the Navy announces that the next carrier will be named Enterprise CV-N80. The decision closes a circle, connecting the newest nuclear supercarrier to the ship that fought from the beginning of the Pacific War to nearly its end. The veterans who survived to hear the announcement are in their 90s, old men who served as teenagers aboard CV-6. They receive the news with satisfaction that Enterprise will sail again, carrying the name forward into generations that will never know war as they knew it. Some cry at the announcement, Emotions overwhelming control, memories of friends lost, and battles survived flooding back after 70 years. Others smile quietly, knowing that Enterprise will live on in spirit, even though the physical ship is long gone. The story of USS Enterprise CV-6 is ultimately the story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things under circumstances that tested them beyond normal human limits. They were farm boys and city kids, college graduates and high school dropouts, professionals and draftees. They became sailors and aviators not because they sought glory, but because their country needed them, and they answered. They fought not for abstractions like freedom and democracy, but for immediate things: the men beside them, the ship beneath them, the mission assigned them. They survived battles they should have lost, endured conditions that should have broken them, and accomplished things that should have been impossible. And when the war ended and the parades finished and the glory faded, they returned to ordinary lives and rarely spoke about what they'd experienced, carrying memories too profound for words and losses too painful to share. They were Enterprise, and Enterprise was them, and together they wrote a chapter of naval history that will never be equaled or forgotten. The ship is gone, but the legacy remains. Proof that one ship and one crew can change history when circumstances demand it and courage answers.